Okay, well, welcome everyone to our first China Macro and Finance Study Group workshop. This inaugural workshop is sponsored by Peking University HBS Business School. Peng Fei will give us give an introduction to our workshop and the study group, and then we will start. Each of the presenter will have 35 minutes, and then the discussant will give a 15-minute discussion. After that, there will be a 10-minute open discussion. Peng Fei?
Hello, can you hear me? Because I'm not sure something happened to my phone.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so yeah, thank you all for joining.
Okay, but we cannot see you.
Because somehow I enter into this safe drive mode, but I don't know how to exit.
Oh, now we can see you.
Now we can see you.
Okay. So so dear colleagues and friends and ladies and gentlemen and excellence, and thank you all for joining the inaugural workshop of China Macro and Finance Study Group. I'm Peng Fei Wang, the Associate Dean for Peking University HBC Business. It's a great honor for me to give this opening remark. The China Macro and Finance Study Group was initiated by a group of active, passionate and ambitious young scholars in the macro finance field, including Cui Wei, Winston Du, Kai Li, Ernest Liu, Mindy Xiaolang, Shen Xin Zhang. The objective of this platform is to promote research in macroeconomics and finance by young scholars in China and the Chinese scholars overseas through these frequent workshops and other academic events. I would first like to thank those pioneers in organizing this workshop sequence, and it's a great public services to the Chinese young scholars in finance and in the macro. I would also like to thank that our senior colleagues. Many of the senior colleagues are willing to serve as a discussant to the young scholars and to allow them to stand on the giant. I'm very confident that this workshop will benefit both of the younger scholars and our senior colleagues. So let me give you a very brief introduction of the PHBS Business School and the Sargent Institute of Quantitative Economics and Finance. And the Chinese economy has reached to a point at which the complexity of the economy requires very rigorous academic insights and methodology to guide the future economic reforms and development. I think this initiative is exactly the right thing to do. It also perfectly consistent with the major mission of the Sargent Institute of Quantitative Economics and Finance and the Peking University HBC Business School. That is why our school has been firmly supporting this initiative of a study group from day zero. Peking University HBC Business is a leading business school in China, located in Shenzhen, known as the Silicon Valley of China. In 2017, our school created the Sargent Institute of Quantitative Economics and Finance under the leadership of Professor Thomas Sargent. We are aiming to build a world-leading academic institute in China's south. To achieve such a goal is a long journey, and it will never be successful without the help of the academic community. Therefore, we have been organizing various academic events to enrich our connection with the world-leading intellectual minds. For instance, our annual PH Sargent Institute Workshop of Macroeconomics and Finance has become one of the most influential and rigorous workshop conferences in China. We have hosted the second China International Conference in Macro, and we are hosting Peking NUS Annual International Conference in Quantitative Finance and Economics. The collaboration with China Macro and Finance Study Group this time is another manifestation of our great determinations. I hope that we have the great pleasure to host you someday in person after the COVID-19 pandemic is over. Although the COVID-19 pandemic has put on hold academic change in person, I believe it will only enhance our friendship in this difficult time. I wish we could gather more often, whether virtually or in person, through this study group in the future, because the collective wisdom, passion, and the reach of the network will raise any roof. I now announce the inauguration workshop of China Macro and Finance Study Group begins. My best wish for all of you for a stimulating and nourishing workshop and for the prosperous growth of this study group. Let's all join together and show our support to this platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pengfei. And my name is Kai Li, and it is a great honor for me to chair the first paper session. And the first paper is presented by Jiao Shi from Peking University HSBC Business School. And he's going to talk about exchange rate regimes with multinational production. Jiao, please go ahead. You have 35 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Kai, and thank you for including my papers, including my paper in this wonderful little conference. And I'm very honored to be the first presenter here. So with no delay, let me share my screen. And I hope it's visible right now. Right. So Kai, can you see my share slides right now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So let me start. So I'm going to talk about exchange rates regime under multinational production today. So, well, why looking at multinational production? Well, multinational production is kind of a first order existence in today's world production and trade. They account for 2/3 of world trade, in which over half are simply intra-firm. Multinational production has brought, we would say, developed and developing countries into a massive global production network in an asymmetric way, because you know, the developed and developing countries, they bring different things to this multinational production network. In the developed countries where the ideas are generated, and firms there bring their idea, those blueprints, to developing countries. And developing countries, on the other hand, would offer their local labor to this massive production chain. So that is what is, that's how I envision all the characteristics.
Okay, I think you're not muted.
To capture in this paper. So multinational production are considered to be beneficial for developed and developing countries alike. Specifically for developing countries in the past, you know, they have been very welcoming towards these multinational productions, because you know, these multinational productions are supposed to increase their labor income and also increase their level of technology through technology spillover and transfer. However, a recent strand of literature has pointed out that these multinational production tends to, while they bring all these benefits, needless to speak, they also tend to let these developing countries to import economic fluctuations as well. So Bergin, Finstra, and Hansen in 2 consecutive papers have pointed out, and they have documented and pointed out that the multinational production that was taking place in Mexico's maquiladora industries, where, you know, these are special economic zones that kind of host the multinational production who are headquartered in the United States. They have documented that employment in these industries actually experience a very high volatility, higher than that either in the regular industries in Mexico or in the US on average. So my paper is going to be kind of very related to that economic fluctuation induced by multinational production. But what I'm going to look at jointly with this multinational production is exchange rates regime and its role in terms of either facilitating necessary adjustments or shielding our economy from external shocks. So, well, we know that we still frequently cite, when we talk about the exchange rates regime, we still frequently cite an old insight from Friedman's 1953 paper, when he argues that flexible exchange rates is a way to overcome nominal friction. He pointed out, in fact, at the zenith of the Bretton Woods system, that flexible exchange rates is a way to go, because when you have nominal frictions, and suppose you have a real shock that necessitates an optimal adjustment in a relative international price. But suppose your prices are fixed so that prices cannot do the adjustment. Then he argues that flexible exchange rates can do the role of adjustment, can replace or compensate for that nominal friction. So that insight, albeit being very kind of classic and old, has held rather true in recent open economy macroeconomic studies about optimal monetary policy and exchange rate policy. For example, in their summary papers by Clarida and Corsetti et al. So, it has been pointed out that the literature in general favors a inward-looking Taylor rule with no exchange rates intervention. Of course, there are important exceptions to this conclusion. For example, we have a currency or pricing that prevents exchange rates from kind of pass through to relative international prices. Deru and Engel 2011 are some pioneer papers on this. This is followed by Gopinath research very recently about the dominant role of United States dollars. And also under the zero lower bound, people have studied the performance of single currency area and highlighted some important exceptions to a flexible exchange rate optimality. So Cook and Devereux 2016 and Gruo and Monacelli 2019 are some pioneer papers in that strand. So here I'm not going to talk about price stickiness nor zero lower bound. What I'm going to kind of look at here is a CQH. So before I move there, let me just quickly kind of review and kind of bring out an empirical regularity that motivates my study. So first of all, despite what economists said about the desirability of flexible exchange rate, if we look at exchange rates regions around the world, it turned out to be pretty clear that the world as a whole is not kind of firmly moving towards a more flexible exchange rate. So Rose 2011, Isteki et al. 2020 have both pointed out that regions with limited flexibility remain in the majority. So here I have this taken from Rose. So if we look at exchange rates region over time across the world, it seems that so here we have IMF's Dior exchange rates region classification. So clearly flexible floating exchange rates has gained momentum after the breakup of the Bretton Woods. But that trend seems to be reversing exactly like during the 1990s, when we think the globalization of multinational production has come to its a great height after the World War II. And then if we look at other clarifications, that message seems to be clear. First of all, the world as a whole are not moving towards flexible exchange rate. And second of all, there seems to be a sort of a reversal, at least stagnation in the 1990s. So, which caused me to wonder, who are those, countries who are kind of rejecting floating exchange rate? So it turns out that when I dig a little more into it, these countries that has an exchange rate control or try to at least stabilize their exchange rate, turns out to not be the set of countries who reject embracing international market. So if we look at across countries, and here I'm kind of examining one correlation. I'm examining how basically the degree in which a country is willing to be integrated into the world production chain. And the proxy I kind of find for that is a classic in the literature. Basically, we take inward FDI stock to GDP ratio, put that on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have the Isteki et al.'s measurements of exchange rate flexibility. So when we go up the axis, we have more flexible exchange rate. So if we look at this plot, clearly there are a set of countries who both are somewhat closed in terms of embracing word FDI, and also have limited flexibility in exchange rates. But I think what's striking here is not the overall like negative relationship, but that when we kind of move out on the x-axis, when we go to this really open and mostly developing countries, it turns out that none of these countries seem to kind of prefer the flexible exchange rates at all. So which is somewhat perplexing, because we tend to think that if you are opening your borders to embrace international capital flow, why don't you do the same thing? Kind of let your exchange rates be determined by the free flows on the market. So what I'm going to kind of well, there's a big literature which my paper builds upon. For time's sake, I'm going to skip that right now. But what I'm going to do in this paper is to build up a model, a theory, to explain why why does this relationship, this negative relationship, exist. It's going to be a two-country north-south international macro model. In this model, we have multinational productions, so firms can choose their production location. There will be endogenous and time-varying multinational production, and what's generated is difference in productivity to start with. So we have this developed and developing country kind of paradigm. We are going to have nominal rigidity in the labor market, so that there will be sluggish adjustments in aggregate wage rates, and consequently, nominal exchange rates is going to affect relative real wage and labor demand. And we're going to see also that multinational production is also going to respond to relative real wage by moving their production overseas when the production cost overseas drops. So this is how exchange rates region and multinational production start to kind of interact with each other. It's because of this nominal rigidity. So what we're showing here is that, first of all, multinational production tends to exacerbate business cycle volatility. And second of all, we show that exchange rate stability can go a long way to mitigate this adverse short-run effect of multinational production. And this is true somewhat perplexingly under both nominal shocks and under real shocks too. So with no delay, let me just jump into the model. So the model setup is pretty simple. It's a standard New Keynesian international macro model. We have two countries. One of them is a developed country, the other is developing country. In each country have households, firms, governments. The countries trade assets and goods. The only thing that I add to this is that I allow firms in either country to decide to move to another country to produce. Now, in equilibrium, however, when I endow the developed country with higher productivity, this is the equivalent outcome. So multinational firms originating from the developed country are going to produce in the developing country, and then they are thus going to be referred to as multinational enterprises, MNEs. So I'm going to kind of now go over the model very quickly. I'm going to focus on the parts that are not standard in international macro model. So here are our households. The households has a kind of time separable utility, which is increasing consumption, decreasing labor supply, and then it's subject to a demand shock. And we assume that this time separable utility is again separable in consumption and employment. So the composite good is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate over north and south composite good. And each of these country-specific good baskets in turn is a CES aggregate over a continuum of individual goods. So these are standard in the literature. So when alpha is greater than 1/2, there is consumption home bias. So labor are immobile across countries. That's what's require firms to chase labor rather than the other way around. Now, each household in our economy is a monopolistic supplier of a differentiated type of labor, and firms are going to produce final products using the composite labor, which is a CES aggregate of different types of labor. So when you produce, you need some laborers, manufacturing workers, managers, sales, marketing, blah blah blah. So you need to use a basket of work of labors, different type of labors. each slightly different. So the laborers have marketing power, that is to say. So they are going to engage in the cargo type wage setting. So in each period, a household is going to be able to reset wage, reoptimizes to W2.th with probability more than theta. Otherwise, it's just going to charge a wage rate that is possibly weight indexed to the average aggregate inflation. So the period budget constraint under a complete set of nominal amounts is rather standard. So we have the household's total value of consumption and portfolio saving is less than its subsidized labor income and its portfolio income from last period, plus the transfer from firms and the transfer or tax by the government. Both of these are lump sum. So here we let the government subsidize labor as the optimal rate tau W. This is just a trick to make the steady states efficient. So that the government is simply doing a fiscal transfer. It's rather passive. The monetary policy is going to, in our benchmark setting, follow a inflation targeting Taylor rule, where new T here is monetary shock. So firms in our model, so each country has a unit mass of monopolistically competitive firms, and each firm are going to basically use the composite labor to produce. Their production function are linear in this composite labor. The firms have a firm-specific productivity level phi, which is distributed Pareto, and then they also their TFP is also affected by the country-level productivity shock. We make northern firms more productive on average by giving them on average a higher phi, so that multinationals are going to endogenously kind of engender from this environment. So what's special about multinational production is that some multinationals can take their blueprints with them when they move to the foreign soil, so that they can bring their productivity parameters and combine them with the foreign labor, essentially. So what is the location decision then? So as soon as the multinational production will have to pay a real sunk cost F in units of a host country labor input, impurity -1 in order to produce a broad impurity. So the firm's problem is pretty simple. They're going to choose a production location, like one period prior to the production takes place. And its location choice is to move to produce in the foreign soil if and only if the expected discounted excess profits that they earned in South. This is when we describe a northern firm's problem. So the excess profits that they would earn in the South exceeds their profits earned in the North by a big enough margin to compensate for the kind of the sunk costs they have to pay, the F they have to pay. So when we kind of substitute in the firm's, the firm's optimal decision impurity, so we know what's price they're going to set, what's that's going to depend on, what their demand is going to depend on. We can basically write down that the same decision rule into the break-even condition. So the decision rule basically says that the firm is going to move to foreign to produce if that's aggregate gain on the left-hand side is greater than that fixed cost. So here are several key forces that's worth looking at from this equation. So here omega are basically the real wage. So this is W over P, the real wage rate. So omega is the real wage at home in the North, and omega star. So star here denotes the foreign counterparts, so the southern counterpart for the northern firms. So basically, if we look at this bracket, it seems to only make sense. Q here is the real exchange rate. So that it only makes sense if, it only makes sense to move to producing the foreign if you expect the foreign real wage adjusted by the real exchange rate is lower than the home real wage. Mu here is the elasticity of substitution and it's greater than 1. So the gain from multinational production is a lower southern real wage. Now, conditional on the same macroeconomic kind of variables, we do see that more productive firms, so the firm-specific productivity does enhance the gain. So that more productive firms have larger gain. Therefore, we know that there exists a cutoff productivity because our productivity are distributed Pareto. So there will exist a cutoff productivity level phi tilde t-1 such that every north firm with productivity level greater than that cutoff productivity will be operating as a multinational in purity. So that's pretty much the driving force of this entire model. How multinational production respond to macroeconomic conditions. So we can now talk about
sorry to interrupt. Can I ask a clarifying question? Does the kavo pricing in different countries matter for that condition? You have
the kavo pricing in different countries?
Yeah.
Yes, wait. So here is for this break-even condition?
Yeah.
Oh no, so this is derived only by using the firm's problem. The kavo price, the kavo pricing in wage setting obviously is going to affect the equilibrium outcome of everything. But this condition is not affected by kavo pricing.
I see. But I thought
yeah, it's only the firm's problem.
But the profits, which will depend on the frequency that you can adjust prices in each country, probably will affect the entry decisions.
So the firms actually. So here I do not have sticky price. I only have sticky wage. So right, the kavo setting, wage setting is pertains to wage setting. Yeah, the firms here actually have flexible prices. Right. Thank you for the question. So let me go to the long run equilibrium. So we can, solve out the steady state and prove that in the long run, in the steady state, when the countries have different average productivity and are otherwise identical, the multinational firms are going to originate from the high productivity country, and then they're going to relocate to produce in the low productivity country. And then what we show below, the dynamics of the model around the steady states are going to be derived, assuming that indeed multinational productions are going to follow this general pattern. So that's the steady state. Now, one of the key results that underlines our welfare implication later is basically the firm allocation, relocation here. So here we can basically, when we simplify the model to one that is symmetric, we can analytically solve out in first order. Here, all the Hess variables are the percentage deviation from steady state. And D over a variable signifies the difference between home variable and foreign counterpart. So we can solve out the cutoff productivity and find out basically this is what characterizes multinational production. What we find, or what we want to emphasize here, is that it responds to all the shocks in the model. So the monetary shocks, the productivity shocks, and demand shocks. But we can also easily solve out the optimal response, which is only negative alpha 3 times ATD. So that in this model, we see that production location can over-respond to nominal and real shocks alike, in a response that, in the sense that it shouldn't respond to nominal shocks, but it does. And when it responds to real shocks, it's over-response. Right. So let me just go to the simulation section. So we parameterize the model using those standard in the literature. And here is the first key result, the welfare implication. So here we are examining monetary shocks only. So on the x-axis, we have the standard deviation of the monetary shocks, so that when we go out here, business cycle becomes more volatile. And then this blue line here is our benchmark model. So this is our world welfare. So what happens here is that, well, something that we would expect, right? So when business cycle volatility becomes larger, welfare drops. It drops because people don't like these, the utilities concave in consumption, convex in employment. So people don't like uncertainty. So that's you have welfare dropping. But the interesting part of this is, what if there's no multinational production? So here we have, basically a green line here, a green dash line here. That's basically take our benchmark model, but shut down multinational production. So that's, of course, domestic production model. In that model, clearly you lose in a steady state because multinational production, as we kind of highlight, is welfare improving in a steady state. It's good in the long run. But I think the feature I like to highlight here is that when the business cycle becomes more volatile, what happens is that your welfare kind of drops, but it drops faster under multinational production. So why is that? So the key result here really depends on basically how the multinational production are responding to the shocks. So consider, say, we have a let's say in the developing countries, say there's a monetary expansion, right? And then with that monetary expansion, optimally what should happen? Optimally, nothing should happen, right? Because money is neutral without nominal rigidity. So that's, nothing should respond. We should stay as the steady state. Now let's think about what happens if there's sticky wage, but no multinational production. We know that's because wages are sticky, real wage is going to drop in the South. Southern workers are going to work more because their workload is determined by demand, right? So that's when Southern workers work more, that's a deviation from the efficient steady state, and that is inefficient. Now let's superimpose on it multinational production. So what's going to happen? Production here is a force that exacerbates the inefficient allocations. Why? Because multinationals, their nature is to move to the place to produce where production cost is lower. So with that aforementioned monetary expansion in the South, the Southern real wage is going to drop relative to that in the North. So multinationals are going to move to the South to produce. And when they do that, what happens is that further increases labor demand in the South and pushing it further away, therefore, from the efficient steady state. So that is the kind of the intuition behind this welfare implication. So what we're going to do, and I should argue from here, is that, well, it turns out that you can use stable exchange rates to counteract that inefficiency. So why is that? So let me just say a little more about it. So what's happening here is that wages are sticky, but the exchange rate is flexible. So that's so think about what's happening. So optimally with that monetary expansion, optimally you should have a equal proportional increase in price and wage rate, leaving the real wage unchanged. So no real variable should respond to it. But what happens is that with the sticky wage, it cannot. So the wage can only say, wage would like to go up in the South, but it can only do so inadequately. But exchange rates is flexible. So exchange rates can fully depreciate to reflect the entirety of the monetary shock. So what you have is that a very flexible exchange rate is going to bring down the Southern relative real wage. So that is the rationale under which really the exchange rate can be too flexible in this case, right? So what we are going to show or analyze in the next section is basically, this is what's going to happen if we have monetary policymaker targeting exchange rates in addition to inflation. So we have our original monetary policy, but we add in a term that basically says that monetary policy is going to also target exchange rates change. So rho S here is a strength with which monetary policy target exchange rates is greater than 0. So basically, when exchange rates depreciates in the home country, you want to increase your interest rate to attract more capital flow into your country and prop up the exchange rate. So with that very simple addition, first of all, is calculate world welfare again. So under standard Taylor rules, this is our benchmark welfare. We do see that when with that nominal exchange rates targeting, and here we are increasing the targeting strength, we do see that there's a welfare gain, and it was quite steep initially and then flattens out. So in general, exchange rate stabilization improves world welfare. So how is that happening? Why is exchange rate stabilization desirable? So in this case, we could show in a symmetric simplified model that's a second order approximation to the period world welfare. Basically say that your world utility depends on the volatility of, because world welfare is an unconditional expectation of this eventually, right? So it depends on the volatility of both consumption and employment. They are decreasing in both these volatility, and it's decreasing in wage dispersion as well. Wage dispersion is defined as this way. So welfare is decreasing in both consumption and employment volatility because people are risk averse, and it's decreasing in wage dispersion because given a certain labor supply, labor inputs into production, a dispersion in wage rates means that you have to work more on average, right? So it's inefficient. So we can show also, like in a standard New-Keynesian model, that the expected wage dispersion depends on the volatility of wage inflation rate, so pi TW. So we could also show, so given that our steady states is efficient, so we see that our utility deviation basically depends on only second order terms, which means that we can't calculate all this is a second order term too. So the dispersion and stuff. So we see that our utility only depends on second order terms, which we can characterize using first order solutions to the endogenous variables, and therefore we could show that how does the exchange rate stabilization affect our labor supply volatility? Well, it turns out that labor depends on, in first order, the sum of work consumption, the sum of and difference of productivity shocks, but it's critically depends on the relative real wage across countries. And rho S is going to affect the labor supply, how it responds to nominal shocks by affecting the relative real wage. And the intuition is what we said before. So that's, when you stabilize the exchange rates, you basically put a cap on the relative inflation. Think about it. So that when you stabilize the exchange rate, you basically put a cap on how much this real wage gap can deviate between countries, right? So over the business cycle, you pretty much suppress that real wage gap, and that suppress the multinational production relocation over the business cycle. We can also show that consumption to the first order approximation are not affected by exchange rate stabilization, and that we can also show that rho S also suppresses the response of wage inflation to monetary shocks. So, the results we have shown earlier is not a quantitative one; it's a qualitative one. So here is the highlights of why this is happening. So here we are looking at basically the response, the impulse response of some key variables: the relative real wage, the mass of multinationals, and the employments, which are the key variables that drives the welfare results here. So we see that. So in the flexible exchange rate, we have the blue line again as our benchmark model. And then we have seen that indeed, when you stabilize the exchange rates, so here we are setting rho S equals to 10, very high number. So we do see that it's suppress the deviation of the relative real wage, which is our relevant real exchange rate here, from the steady state, from the efficient steady state. And by doing that, it suppresses the response of multinationals and the response of employment in every single case. So that's under our nominal shocks. So to sum up, why is this happening? Well, it's done because the real exchange rate follows nominal exchange rates closely, as in data. And nominal exchange rate stabilization leads to stabilization in the relative real wage across countries.
Jiao, you have 2 minutes.
Sure, okay. So therefore welfare improves due to the reduction in volatility of employment. So let me quickly go over the demand shocks as well. So the real shocks is really what Friedman was talking about, because the earlier ones, not really Friedman, because Friedman was talking about flexible exchange rates based on real shocks. That's mostly efficient allocation, right? So basically, when you need, so earlier we need the relative real wage to not adjust because steady state is efficient, right? What if you have a situation in which you want an optimal adjustment in relative price, and wouldn't exchange rate help that? And indeed, Cook and DeRue 2016 has demonstrated Friedman's mechanism under the demand shocks. So what we did next is to basically ask, well, let's put in these demand shocks and ask how does exchange rate stabilization affects welfare under demand shocks. Somewhat to my surprise, it turns out that the presence of multinational production actually reversed the conclusion by Friedman and Cook and Devereux. The idea here is that interaction between sticky wage and multinational production is going to magnify the deviation from efficient allocation under flexible exchange rates. So we have seen how that happened. So what's happening here, this will be my last slides before my conclusion. So what's happening here is that we are choosing between two bad alternatives. So our optimal here is the flexible wage equilibrium, so which is given by this black dotted line, right? So that's our optimal benchmark. Now, when we have flexible exchange rate, what happens is that in each case, right, the relative real wage, the multinational production, the employment, each of them respond the right direction. That when there should be a depreciation, it does depreciate, right? When the employment should drop, it does drop. But multinational production does exaggerate that response. In comparison,
what's on the y-axis of these four diagrams?
Excuse me?
What's on the y-axis of these four diagrams?
Oh, these are the IRFs again. Sorry, these are periods. So we are looking at the response strength.
No, I mean there are four different variables. What are the four variables?
Oh yeah, so this is relative real wage. This is mass multinationals. Sorry, this is North employment and this is South employment, like that. Right. So for example, let's look at the relative real wage. So indeed, the relative real wage should optimally adjust. It should adjust down, right? But and if you have stable exchange rates, it does not allow that adjustment to happen. So that's you are overstabilized, right? So that's not good. But what's even worse is that if you let multinationals to fully exploit that market inefficiency created by the sticky wage in the first place, that is under that situation, in fact, it's going to the relative real wage is going to drop even more. And then, so we are basically choosing between two alternatives, and it turns out that having the stabilized exchange rates is the lesser evil. I think the most striking is that Cook and Devereux has shown us that when you have fixed exchange rate, your economy adjusts in the wrong direction at times, and it is true for when we look at the Southern employment, for example, that when it should optimally increase, right, with that northern monetary tightening, it actually decreases. But even under that situation, it decreases. Its deviation from the optimal is still smaller than that under multinational production in a flexible exchange rate. So what we're saying is that stable exchange rates might not achieve the optimal, but it's a lesser evil. So this is quantitative. So compared to that under our monetary shocks, this is quantitative. So it's obvious you can parameterize the model, suppress multinational production, you can push it. You can push these responses down. So I actually have done this exercise, kick out multinational production. I restored what Friedman and Cook and Devereux said, that under demand shocks, you don't want to have fixed exchange rates. But I think it's interesting that the presence of multinational production can reverse this conclusion. So anyway, I'm out of time, sorry. So let me just conclude by saying that exchange rate stabilization improves stability and benefits both countries. And this is true under both monetary shocks and demand shocks. Right.
Okay,
So,
thank you, Zhao.
Thank you very much. We stop sharing.
Our discussant is Luca Fornano from CREI. Luca, please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So let me just put the slides on. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Very good. So first of all, many thanks for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. So I really enjoyed reading it, and it was cool to think a little bit about it. So Joe gave you an excellent overview of what the paper is about. So let me just start by giving you my summary, the point that I found more relevant and interesting. So essentially, the paper asks the question of how multinational production affects the conduct of monetary policy, and the choice between different exchange rate regimes. And to do so, it provides a two-country new Keynesian model, pretty standard, except for the presence of multinational production and foreign direct investment. In particular, what happens in this model is that some firms can choose whether to produce at home or abroad. In order to produce abroad, they need to make an investment. So you can think of these firms relocating production abroad, really making an FDI, foreign direct investment. And to me, the most interesting insight from this paper is that the presence of this multinational production amplifies the employment response to monetary shock. So why is that the case? Well, because in the standard new Keynesian model, essentially, the response of the economy to a monetary shock is fully determined by the demand side of the economy. So what happens usually is that, for instance, when the central bank increases the interest rate, then the exchange rate appreciates, home good becomes more expensive, so there is a drop in demand for home-produced goods, and that put downward pressure on labor demand and employment. What's cool about this paper is that there is a supply side channel, which is triggered by changes in monetary policy, because now when the exchange rate appreciates, the cost of labor increases, and this induces firms to relocate production away from home toward the foreign country. So I like very much this perspective that monetary policy can also affect the supply side of the model. And of course, this amplifies the response to employment, because as firms relocate abroad, there is less labor demand at home, and this induces a bigger drop in employment. That explains this amplification effect. And then, the way the paper frames this result is that if you're a country in which monetary policy is quite erratic, so it's subject to monetary shock, which push monetary policy away from the targets of stabilizing inflation or the output gap, then it might be very costly to have this relocation effect. And then it might be a good idea to fix the exchange rate in order to reduce the volatility of monetary policy and in order to mitigate these costs, which are particularly large under multinational production. And that's cool, again, because, as Jiao showed, we see a correlation between fixing the exchange rate and attracting FDIs. Okay, so that was the summary. So what I want to do during the rest of my discussion is, first, I want to provide you some thoughts about how optimal monetary policy would look like in this model. So the paper focuses on simple monetary policy rule. I want to think a little bit about how monetary policy, optimal monetary policy could be. And the reason why I want to do that is because that might connect the paper to two debates that I like a lot, that I find very interesting. The first one is about capital flows and productivity growth, and the second one is on expropriation risk. And then if I have time, I will provide a few more specific comments to the paper. Okay, let me start by showing you this figure, which is from a very well-known paper by Gurichas and Jian on the so-called allocation puzzle. So what is the allocation puzzle? It's just the empirical regularity that among developing countries, we see that the fast growers, the ones that have fast productivity growth, are also the ones that export capital, the current account surpluses. And that's interesting because in the standard neoclassical model, you would expect that if you have fast productivity growth, you would attract capital. So the data go in the opposite direction compared to the standard neoclassical model. And then if you dig a little bit deeper in this puzzle, as Gurichas and Jian have done, you discover that this correlation is purely driven by accumulation of international reserves. It's purely driven by monetary policy. That is, the fast-growing countries such as China, Thailand, or Korea tend to run current account surpluses because their central banks, their government accumulates a lot of foreign exchange reserves. So there seems to be, monetary policy seems to play a role in explaining this correlation between current account surpluses and fast productivity growth, which is the object of this allocation puzzle literature. Now, one explanation that you can put forward goes like this. Well, in order to accumulate reserves, central banks need to suppress domestic consumption in order to increase the current account surplus of the country. So reserve accumulation is associated with low demand for domestic consumption. This induces an exchange rate depreciation and puts downward pressure on wages. As wages fall, it becomes more profitable for firms to invest. And so this policy of accumulating reserves will lead to higher investment and faster productivity growth. And well, if you think a little bit about it, format it through a model, you find out quite quickly that this effect is particularly strong in sectors producing tradable goods. That's why, you know, this mechanism is related to the idea of export-led growth. And you can also show that if there are some technological spillovers, so if investment is inefficiently low, then it might be good for a central bank to run this policy. You know? So there might be a role for monetary policy in fostering productivity growth. Now, why do I mention all this? Well, because I think that the model in this paper provides a complementary channel to explain this correlation, and a very interesting one. Why? Well, because as Jiao said, you know, what happens in this framework is that when the exchange rate depreciates, wages fall. But as wages fall, the countries start attracting more FDI because it becomes more profitable for foreign firms to relocate in the home country. So in the model of this paper, for instance, the central bank could run a tight monetary policy. So it could set the policy rate bigger than the national rate so as to induce lower wages and attract FDI. But it would be quite easy to modify the framework to allow for reserve accumulation. And then it could have also this additional policy margin that the central bank could have to you know, depress real wages and attract foreign direct investment. Moreover, you know, this model also provides a link between FDI and productivity. And it's a very direct effect because here foreign firms tend to be more productive than domestic one. So as FDI increases, also the productivity of the firms operating in a given country rises. And you know, you can also add another channel to this model because there is some, not conclusive, but there is some empirical evidence suggesting that foreign direct investment tend to trigger technological spillover toward domestic firms too. Right, so through these two channels, you know, higher FDI will lift productivity growth in a given country. And, you know, now you have some interesting transmission mechanism from monetary policy to FDI and to productivity growth. So personally, I think that it would be interesting to explore this implication of this reasoning for optimal monetary policy, because my guess is that the optimal monetary policy in this framework will somehow actively manage the exchange rate, try to depreciate it compared to what would happen under flexible prices or passive monetary policy in order to attract FDI and increase productivity. You know? And that's a way to link the paper or this research line to the literature on productivity growth and capital flows. However, and this is the link to a second literature, this literature on monetary policy and expropriation risk, it might not be that easy for a central bank to attract FDI through an appropriate management of monetary policy. Why? Because, you know, we know that monetary policy can be used to expropriate foreign investors. So central banks might have an incentive to use monetary policy to expropriate foreigners. And this might pose a time consistency problem for the monetary authority. And this time consistency problem can also be related to FDI because, you know, this is just a guess, but what I think would happen in this framework is that ex ante, before foreign firms come to the country, the central bank will have an incentive to promise future low real wages, to promise an environment favorable to FDI in order to attract this foreign direct investment. But then ex post, once foreign firms have made the investment and they relocated to the country, my guess is that the central bank will have an incentive to forget its past promises and instead to run a high-pressure economy in order to increase wages so as to squeeze out the profits made by foreign firms and ensure that a lot of the gains from multinational production go to domestic workers. You see, there is a time consistency issue between what the central bank would like to promise ex ante and what it would do actually ex post. And of course, you know, foreign investors are not stupid. So if they anticipated this risk of being expropriated ex post through monetary policy, they will react by limiting foreign direct investment. So how do we solve this problem? Well, one possibility is to credibly fix the exchange rate, because if the central bank can credibly commit to a fixed exchange rate, it will give up this ability to expropriate foreign investors exposed by increasing real wages. And so you see that here is a complementary explanation with respect to the one that Jiao put forward to explain the positive correlation between fixed exchange rates and high FDI. So fixing the exchange rate might be one way to overcome a time inconsistency issue. And I think that this framework, you know, is very well suited to think about these kind of effects. Okay, so
Luca, you have 3 more minutes.
perfect, because this is my last slide. So let me provide a few more specific comments to the paper. So the first one is that, the paper is very well written. I encourage you to read it. It's very interesting. Though I think it would benefit from a bit more explanation. It would benefit from some simple example that clarify some of the insights of the paper. In particular, 2 questions that I have. The first one is that I could not fully understand why fixed exchange rate improve upon monetary autonomy. So what I got is that essentially fixing the exchange rate works by neutralizing monetary shocks. So if you're fixing the exchange rate for a given monetary shock, your actual monetary policy, your interest rate will move by less. But it would be nice to clarify this a bit better. And second, I found the part on demand shock very interesting because I found it very counterintuitive. But so far the paper is just a verbal discussion and some simulation. It would be interesting to provide an example to explain why multinational production amplify the response to demand shocks as well. Another comment that I have is that well, relocating production takes time. Of course, it's not something that a firm can do in 1 quarter or perhaps even in a year, to move production to a foreign country. But typically in the new Keynesian literature, we tend to think as monetary shock as short-lived phenomenon, something that might last 1-2 quarters, but not go beyond that. So I will frame the paper a little bit by thinking about sources of persistent monetary shocks. For instance, the zero lower bound might be a source of a persistent too tight monetary policy compared to the one that replicates the natural allocation, or deficit monetization can be another source of monetary shock. This one, pointing toward the too expansionary monetary policy. And then this is my very last comment. So the paper is mainly about monetary shock. There is a part about demand shock. Currently, the literature on open economy has shown that in order to understand the business cycle in open economy, shocks to the UIP, to the uncovered interest parity condition, play an important role. And it would be interesting to add this part into the paper because shocks to the AP might give you, this kind of persistent shocks to the exchange rate that monetary policy could have to neutralize by stabilizing the exchange rate in order to prevent inefficient fluctuations in employment. So it would be interesting to see what happens once you consider shocks to the uncovered interest parity condition. Okay, I will conclude. I think it's a very interesting paper. It's a very important topic. And what I like is that the model is quite tractable. And I think it can be used to revisit many very interesting research questions, especially about optimal monetary policy in developing countries.
Thank you very much, Luca, for such an insightful discussion and for being on time. We have about 7-8 minutes. So first of all, I would like to have Jiao to provide a very brief response.
All right. Thank you so much, Luca. So Luca has kindly provided me with the discussion slides, which caused me to completely stop preparing my presentation and start to look at the references he provided. So insightful, very interesting. So more specifically about the paper, for sure, I think I'm going to kind of include more simplifying examples. In fact, I have to do that for demand shock. I'll probably have to cut the model down, to its very core to show that, why, and how, basically firm relocation kind of aggravates the responses to demand shocks. It's slightly harder than the monetary shocks. So I'm doing that right now. And then about the point where relocation takes time. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the thing is that in the model, the relocation kind of happens kind of period by period. You pretty much have to kind of decide, kind of one period ahead of time where to produce. But I think in reality, you basically, when you go to a country, you are kind of probably there for a while. So that's in reality, FDI will be there for a longer time. So how does that affect the kind of conclusion? I think in reality, what happens is that the firms can choose to place a order in its foreign subsidiary at a good time, right? Say the foreign wage is very low. Let's kind of place a larger order. What inspired me to think so is when there was this Foxconn scandal and people went to Apple's assembly line in China. There were workers complaining that when our firm received a good order, it's not good thing, for us workers, because they know they won't have to overwork. So I think, for sure, there's that's part of the shortage of the model in terms of capturing that richer reality. So, and short to the UIP for sure, I think it's a great suggestion. I'm going to put it in the model. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zhao. Now let's open our discussion to all the audience. I wonder whether you have any questions.
Kai, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. So I just wonder, if we think about the location choice, what if the firms can do cross-border acquisitions and directly employ people over there? That's first. The second, about fiscal policy, if we may want to think about perhaps correct distortions domestically, does that imply anything about?
Sorry, Wei. I was kicked out of the conference right when you are asking the question. I just returned. So can you sorry repeat?
Yeah. So the first question is, do you think cross-border acquisitions may avoid this problem instead of choosing directly in another place to open a company or a firm or a plant? The second question is about fiscal policy. I know the paper is focusing on monetary policy, but since there are distortions anyway, we live in the second best world and anything can happen. Do you think that tax policy could be helpful more than the monetary policy? Thank you.
All right, thank you for the question. So about cross-border mergers and acquisitions, so when I was looking at this multinational production between developed and developing countries, I did find that greenfield FDI is more prevalent. Just because these firms, they have very specific capital. They want to produce kind of according to their blueprints. So it's not as common. Like so cross-border merger and acquisition are extremely common when you actually try to go to different markets. Have access to a different market, or actually acquire technology and etc. It's just like in the type of multinational production I'm looking at, it's less prevalent, but I think it's an important kind of force in terms in cross-border FDI. I haven't considered that much about how fiscal policy can be used to remedy this problem. When I was considering policy options, I was kind of weighing between possible kind of intervention in terms of preventing the kind of business cycle kind of type of relocation of firms. I was thinking about also the possible kind of capital controls. Turns out that both of these are harder, and I think harder to implement than monetary policy, because that's kind of require you, because the FDI is still like welfare improving in the long run. So you kind of want to have the long run type of FDI, but you want to kind of restrict its fluctuations. So it's whenever you use like a fiscal policy or a otherwise basically discriminatory things, you need to be able to tell who is relocating, who is a good person to relocate, and what kind of other relocations should we kind of ban or tax. So I just find out that monetary policy seems to be better in a sense that it's kind of autonomous. It does not require you to tell who is good, who's a good firm, who's a bad multinational production, and it just works through moderating that fluctuation in the real wage that attracts all types of firms. So, but I think I should give like a fiscal policy and more kind of perhaps like more complicated capital control, a more thought in this environment.
Okay, thank you, Zhao and Wei. Yeah, we're just on time to conclude our session. Thank you all again for Zhao, for Luca, and for all the audience. Now I would like to hand over to my fellow co-organizer of this workshop, Winston Do from UPenn, and he is going to chair the next paper session. Winston, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kai. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Next paper will be presented by Zefeng and discussed by Karen Lewis. So Zefeng is really a junior young scholar. He just graduated from Stanford and will be joining Peking University. And Karen Lewis, that definitely don't need more introduction, but I will say a few words. It's our great pleasure to have Karen to agree to discuss this paper. Karen is definitely top expert of international finance as a pricing macroeconomics. But as I recommend to my committee members, she's also very supportive to junior faculty. So I definitely benefit a lot, as a junior colleague from Karen. So now I'll give the floor to Zefeng. Zefeng, you can start. You can start to share this. You have 45 minutes.
Thanks. Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Is it clear? Does it have a problem?
It's clear. Yeah, you can.
Okay,
start.
okay, great. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so where's my full screen? Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to invite me to the paper section. I'm super excited to talk about my paper. And I'm still a student at Stanford. I'm graduating in like half a month. And after that, I'm joining the PKU Guanghua immediately. So it's actually quite exciting to me. Okay, so let's start with my presentation. So first of all, what is the US exorbitant privilege? As my title suggests, I'm interested in this phenomenon. Before I talk about that, let's first look at the graph. So on the graph, the purple dashed line is the US net foreign assets, corresponding to a right scale, scaled by the US GDP. The net foreign asset is defined as the US holding of foreign assets minus foreign holding of the US assets. We can see it drops from about 10% before the crisis to now at the end of sample is about -40%. So it's a huge drop. On the other hand, we look at the yellow line, which is the net investment income. So what is net investment income? Net investment income is a major part of the primary income on the current account. It measures the net income flow due to a cross-holding of assets. Specifically, it is the income received from the US holding of foreign assets minus the income paid out by the foreign holding of US assets. And we see that it's positive, and it starts from about 0.5% of the US GDP, corresponding to the left scale, to over 1% after the crisis. So what does this graph suggest? You can think of it as the US is borrowing money from the rest of the world, but actually it is the rest of the world are paying interest payment to the US. And the US is the only large net borrower country with this property. It borrows a lot of money. It has a very negative net foreign assets, but it earns a positive net investment income. And that's called the US exorbitant privilege. And we can see that the gap is wider after crisis, suggesting that the exorbitant privilege is getting larger after crisis. So before I talk further, let's also look at on the other hand of the.
Can I ask a clarification question, Zefeng?
Yes.
Yeah, from the previous figure, the net investment income, does that include, let's say, the dividend income from stocks and the interest payments from bonds and all of those?
Yes.
Got it. Yeah. So
yes,
is that more
it's
like
based on cash flow accounting? You can think of it from accounting standard. It's cash flow accounting, so it has to be the actual flow that makes the border. Let's get the accounting.
Okay.
So let's look at the other side of the story. How about China? So China is a large lender. If we look at the purple line, China has net foreign assets of persistently around 20% of the GDP. China has 1.4 trillion 14 trillion US dollar GDP. So it converts to about 3 trillion net foreign assets in US dollars. But for the net invest income, we can see that China is actually making payments to the rest of the world. So it's on the other hand of the story. So why is that? Well, for the US, when the US are holding the foreign assets, it's holding the high return risky assets. But when the foreigners holding US assets, it's mostly on the safe low return assets. But for the China, it's a different story. We have a lot of foreign reserves that are earning very, very low returns. As of the currently February 2021 this year, we still hold over $1 trillion of US treasuries. Given the US treasuries are at zero lower bound, they virtually generate zero income. Okay, so these two graphs motivates my central question of the paper is that what is the special role of the US that explains the exorbitant privilege? So this paper takes the perspective of the US. So let's just leave the China aside for now. So before I raise my story, let me first discuss a bit about what the conventional view is. So the conventional view is based on asymmetric risk sharing. Is that exorbitant privilege comes from insurance premium. So what is that? Let's still take the US and China as an example. So to explain what the conventional view is. So the asymmetric risk sharing implies in the normal time, China should buy the US treasuries. They say they are safe and as insurance products. And when bad time happens, China can sell these safe assets to claim the insurance benefit. So the role of the US is providing an insurance product to China, and it earns an insurance premium at during normal time, and in the crisis time, it should pay China the insurance benefit. This story sounds pretty well during the normal time, as we are observing that China indeed are buying a lot of safe assets for precautionary saving motive, as many people suggest. But however, this story is hard to reconcile in the financial crisis, that actually China is not benefiting from the insurance products. It's not claiming the insurance benefit. Instead, it's even buying more US treasuries during the crisis. So in aggregate pattern for the world, so I come up with 3 style effects that asymmetric risk sharing is hard to explain. So first, we observe there's a large fall of net foreign assets for the US, but not net investment income. This suggests that the exorbitant privilege is still there and getting larger instead of it becomes exorbitant duty, as suggested by the Gerogios and Rui and Govila paper. The second stylized fact that the US dollar is appreciating during the financial crisis, and for which the majority paper call it a reserve currency paradox. And the third fact is the rest of the world buying US treasuries at a very high price, reflected by large CIP violations on the US treasuries, that US treasuries are more expensive than the treasuries from the other developed countries. So I'll explain what the facts look like later, but let's just have these summaries in mind right now. And so that's the reason that I raise a different story to the conventional risk sharing view. So the main idea of my view is that the US is a service provider instead of the conventionally believed the insurance provider. So the US is if you think of a real world example, the US is a company that provides a service instead of a global bank, a hedge fund, or insurance company suggested by the other paper. So why is the US not a bank? So if a bank is in a crisis, what you want to do? You want to take money out from bank. It's just like the 1930 crisis. but that's not what happened during the financial crisis. It's like if US a bank, then the rest of the world should taking money out of the US, but instead the rest of the world are putting more money into the US. So that's so it's not consistent with.
Sorry, can
So
I?
my story is that the US is a service provider providing this. It's US treasuries are providing this liquidity value and convenience value. So it's called the global safe asset. That's a world financial intermediary needs to hold. And the US exorbitant privilege is their service fee paid by the rest of the world.
Sorry,
So
I have
as I
a
explained,
clarification question.
Sorry?
I have a clarification question. So you
Yes.
just mentioned that in the crisis, I think the paper by Maggiore and some of the paper by Greenchards, they say that during the 2008 financial crisis, US actually transferred a lot of wealth to the rest of the world. So they're saying there are two sides of the coin of US being the exorbitant privilege. They enjoy the exorbitant privilege during normal times. However, during the financial crisis, they actually transfer wealth to the rest of the world. And that is, they call the other side of the coin. But I think you just mentioned that in the crisis, actually the rest of the world putting more money into the US. So that seems a little bit contradictory. Can you like explain what you mean by that?
It's yes, you are right. It's a very important part of this paper is that I will show you later that why their perception is actually not correct. That the US is not transferring wealth out of the to the rest of the world. I'll
But
explain
is
why
that
later.
like an empirical fact instead of theoretical result?
Yes, they are interpreting the empirical facts not correctly.
I see.
I will
Okay.
show you later why within my model. Okay, so I just explained that. So let me just briefly explain what my story says during the financial crisis. So a global financial shock hits, and the global financial intermediaries becomes constrained, but the U.S. treasuries remain to be safe and liquid globally. That's the property of the U.S. treasuries, and I would say it's exogenous. The U.S. treasuries have that property, and so what happens is the world would rush to U.S. treasuries to help their financial intermediaries relax their constraint, and that benefits the U.S. That the U.S. can react by buying high expected return assets. So that explains why later that the exorbitant privilege actually becomes larger. So for this paper, I built a model explaining the US external balance sheet both qualitatively and quantitatively. For the time's sake, I have only 35 minutes. I'll just skip the literature slide and go directly into a model. Sorry for that. So the model is a two-country extension of the Goethe-Corradi model that I incorporate with safe assets. So the model has two countries. Each country has three agents: the household, the financial intermediary, the government. And the financial intermediaries is the most important agent. And so there's one representative household for each country. They trade good. And they can only deposit in a financial intermediary as they are saving. And the financial intermediary are the agents that will exchange assets on the international financial market. And the government is the supplier of the safe asset. And one feature about the model is that the home country are only buying the home government bond as safe assets, but the foreign countries, foreign intermediary are both considering foreign government bond and home government bond as safe assets. And I will show later how it looked like in the actual model, but this is just a picture of how the model works. So let me briefly discuss the basic setup for the I'm not going to present every detail of my model because of time constraint, but let me just quickly go through the basic setup. So there's infinite horizon, it's discrete time, it's an endowment economy with two goods, traded and non-traded goods. there's one numerator is pretty good. And why I can assume that for simplicity case is that I assume dollar pricing and 1 unit of traded good will be exactly worth $1. That's just a technical assumption. And there is a risky tree producing traded good. So 1 unit of tree is located in the home. There is the Xi units in the foreign country. So there's a trees there's a fixed amount of trees located in the home and the foreign country, but the home can hold the trees located in a foreign country and vice versa. So countries can hold trees that are located in the other country. That will be where the net foreign asset and the net investment income comes from, because they are holding the other country's trees. So these are for the traded goods. For the non-traded good, they are just endowment to the household. And the government would exogenously determine the bond supply, which is equivalent to safe asset supply. So the financial intermediaries are the most important agent in the model. So let me explain it very carefully. So each country has a unit measure of the Goethe-Crowdy financial intermediaries. I will also call it banks. So what they do, they take deposit from the households. They will invest it. They will invest the money that they get from household in risky trees and safe assets in both countries. So as a standard Goethe-Crowdy bankers, each period there's a fraction exits and replaced by the new bankers. And when they exit, they will transfer their profit back to the households. And when the new intermediaries, new bankers come in, then the household will give them startup money. So that's how these agents look like. So each intermediary faces a balance sheet constraint. So for this equation, the left-hand side is their equity plus liability side. So the NHT is the equity or their net worth. For the new bankers, it's just exogenously given by the household. For the existing bankers, it's just they are accumulating their profit generated in the past period. And so the DT is the liability side. They are from the household deposits. And the right-hand side is the asset side. So they put money into the risky trees. So QT is the price of the tree, and DT is the risky tree that produces traded good. They can put money in their home government bond. They can put money in their foreign government bond. And after they determine their portfolio allocation, so there will be evolution of the net worth. Next period is just going to be the return of these assets, and you need to pay the deposit back. And this is for home intermediary and the foreign intermediary symmetrics. They do exactly the same thing for the balance sheet constraint. Aside from the balance sheet constraint, what is really, really critical in generating this model's behavior is these financial constraints. So I borrowed the form of the financial constraints from this Aoki, Binago, Kiyotaki paper. And I extended in the two country cases, and the difference between the two countries are very, very critical. So let's first look at the home financial constraint. The left-hand side of the constraint is the value of the value of the financial intermediary given the net worth NHT. It has to be the greater of a fraction times how much risky trees they hold. So this put a constraint on how much the risky tree that the financial intermediaries can hold. And so what determines their capability of holding the risky trees is by this middle term, a fraction. For the standard Goethe-Crowdy model, this is a constant. But in my model, so this determines, it has an exponential form determined by how much safe assets they have in the portfolio. The idea is that if they have more safe assets in their in their portfolio that they use as a collateral, the creditors are going to trust them, trust the financial intermediaries will behave well and don't run away with the trees. And so if they hold more safe asset, then their financial constraint is going to be relaxed. Note there is also so sorry, there's also KIT here. So the KIT is the exogenous state variable representing financial tightness. And for the 2008 financial crisis, I will model it as a shock to this KI. So what is the difference between the home financial constraint and foreign financial constraint? Is that for the foreign financial constraint, their ability to hold safe assets, that fraction, does not only depends on their own safe assets, but also depends on the other country's safe assets. So the home country only uses home government bonds. They have convenience value for them. But for the foreign country, they will use both the home bond and the foreign bond. And the home country is not considering the foreign bond, it's giving them convenience value. So that's asymmetry. This asymmetry here is what is driving this model dynamics. Okay, so then the intermediary is solving a relative standard problem of maximizing their value in a recursive setting. And the solution is will be the linear network. So their value is going to be some side depending on the shocks and the times their networks. So it's linear networks. So before I go to the go further, we need to make a bit of assumptions. So the first is that we will assume the financial constraint binds because we observe the in order for the safe asset to have convenience value, we need we need the financial constraints to bind to have this property. And since we observe convenience yield in the data, and those safe indeed, and the foreign countries are indeed hold that many safe assets for their convenience values, so it will be realistic to assume that this financial constraint would hold. Otherwise, there should be no convenience value, so the safe assets will not be special at all. And when the financial constraints are binding, the home intermediary will not hold any foreign safe assets because the foreign safe assets does not generate any convenience benefit to home. But on the other hand, the foreign intermediaries would hold home safe assets, and that's the most important asymmetry. Okay, so after that, we will get implications for the asset pricing implications that will generate the safe asset would generate the convenience yields for those government bonds, and as well as extra risk premium, or we can call it liquidity premium for the risky asset as well. So how do we understand this? So so the gamma HT is the multiplier on the financial constraint. I call it the shadow value of constraint. And so the convenience yield for the home bond is determined by the shadow value of constraint times the marginal value of net worth. And so if the shadow value of constraint, if the constraint is more tightened, then the convenience yield should be higher. If the $1 extra dollar is worth more for the financial intermediaries, that means they will valuing the convenience benefit more, so the convenience yield will also be higher. And the second, what we need to keep in mind is that the convenience yield between the home and foreign government bond is completely determined by the omega, which is here, the weights. How much weight that a foreign country is put on the home safe assets and foreign asset respectively. And this setup also generates additional risk premium for the tree because in order to hold trees, you need to get liquidity compatibility first. So that will generate some additional return for the trees. Okay, that's we finish the part about the intermediaries, and I just quickly go through the other agents. The other agents are quite standard. We have a standard home representative agent with budget constraint. It's just whatever they get, and they spend money in consumption and saving. And we use endogenous discount factor to just to close out the model. So the model will exhibit a unique steady state instead of a continuum of steady states. And for the governments will just choose exogenous bond supply and chooses tax to endogenous tax to satisfy the budget constraint that they have to hold. Then the last part of the model is the shock specification that we will be considering two types of the shock. The first type of the shock is a financial shock. I already explained it's a chi parameter, which is on the financial constraint. So we'll consider in different scenario that for the benchmark case, we'll consider aggregate financial shock. So a shock that hits both the home and foreign intermediaries. And for we will also consider foreign only shock and home only shock for comparison purposes only. So the benchmark case is that there's a financial shock that hits both the US bank and foreign banks. And the model will result in asymmetric results of the banks. And we are also considering aggregate real shock. That is a payoff of the risky tree. How much of the payoff of the risky tree? Okay, so these slides I will answer the question that why the US is not transferring wealth to the rest of the world. So the argument raised by the Gorichas and Ray and the majority is that because there's a large valuation effect that is making a drop in the net foreign assets. And we observe a drop of net foreign assets because due to a valuation effect. So the US is losing money, and so that US is transferring money out to the rest of the world. But that's not true on the very simple accounting identity in my model. So let's just define the trade balance as the YT over the whatever you produce minus whatever you consume. That will be the rest of the world is either you export or import. And net foreign asset is simple. It's just a home holding of foreign tree minus the foreign holding of home safe asset. The net investment income is also the income from foreign tree minus the income of the safe assets for foreigners holding. And after doing some combining all this accounting identity together, we'll get the BOP relationship that the consumption of the country is determined by your output plus your net investment income minus your net foreign assets, net of the valuation effect. So any change of the net foreign asset that is due to the valuation effect will not have an effect on the consumption or on the trade balance unless there's also a corresponding change in the net investment income. This is not any magic. This is just accounting identity. If you just put everything up together and you cancel out stuff, that's whatever you have. That is very important in the BOP accounting, balance of payments accounting. Any transfer must be recorded in the current account. If it does not appear on the current account, then it doesn't matter. It's as true here. If it needs to have an effect, a change of net foreign asset to have an effect, it cannot be the valuation effect. That does not appear in the current account. It has to be net investment income or from the trade balance, which will appear on the current account. Okay, so let's go through the to the quantitative analysis of the paper. Okay, so let me first explain the stylized facts. So we already showed the left-hand figure from beginning. I want to additionally show the left-hand side figure. So the it's the United States compared to other large net borrowers, and I call it the yield on net foreign assets, which is computed by the net investment income divided by the net foreign assets. We can see that the U.S. is negative, as the US has exorbitant privilege. All the other large net borrowers are positive. I compute the average of them, but if you plot each individual of them, they are all positive except for the US. And we can see this is more negative during the crisis. That implies the US is having a larger exorbitant privilege. It does not replaced by exorbitant duty during the crisis. So the second fact is the exchange rates that we can see in a picture that there's in general a negative relationship of the real exchange rate, US real exchange rate, and the US net foreign assets. So during the crisis, the drop in the US net foreign assets leads to a dollar appreciation, as you can see in the shaded area. That the convention theory predicts opposite, as recorded in Maggiore 2017 paper that he calls the reserve currency paradox that his model cannot explain. And I also want to show the fact for the
Stephen,
treasury
can I
holding,
ask
we can
one
see
quick question? So in the previous slide about the exchange rate, so how do you think about exchange rate in your model?
That's a good question. So the exchange rate is just the marginal utility of the aggregate consumption bundle. So since I have the traded and non-traded good, it will generate exchange rate movement, real exchange rate movement. So we can observe that the rest of the world buying a large amount of treasuries during the crisis, especially the short term. If the red line is the short term, we can see it increases by so much. But for the total treasury holding, for the green line, we can see the foreigners are holding accelerating speeds during that time. And right hand side is the treasury basis to the US, which is the CIP violation of the US treasuries and treasuries from the other developed countries. We can see when the treasuries are very expensive, as this value spikes, the foreigners are actually buying more treasuries. So that's the risk sharing story would predict the opposite.
I'm sorry to disturb you again. I think that the previous slide, yeah, this one is interesting. So can I? So it is equally possible that the demand of the U.S. Treasury is the same, but it's just the supply increase a lot, like 3 rounds of QE from the Fed, such that I look like so in the equilibrium, the supply have to be held by someone. So maybe have nothing to do with the demand side, right?
It has to be demand. It cannot be the supply, because if it's be supply, that means if it's increase in the supply, that would imply that U.S. Treasury should be cheaper instead of being more expensive. The fact that it's simultaneously foreigners are holding more and the U.S. Treasuries become more expensive, it has to be a demand effect instead of a supply effect.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think for the price, you're right. But I mean for the quantity, so the lab one, it could be, in the end, it must be supplied. So when you demand more things, have to be supplied by someone else, right? So yeah. But I see your point. So okay.
Yeah, maybe we can discuss later. Just for the time of sake, let me continue. So
you have 2 more minutes.
How many?
2 more minutes.
Okay, sure. So first, I would match the steady state calibrated would match a pre-crisis average value. For the one country model, these first order moments are not important, but for the 2 country model, these are very important because we want it to match the relative allocation between the 2 countries. The model is able to match the US is having a negative net foreign assets and a positive net investment income within the model, because the US is holding foreign trees and foreign are holding US safe assets, which has a lower return. And this would be a key result for my paper. That is a quantitative result. Is that it matches the second order moment. So we can see the benchmark for the benchmark model. So when there's a financial shock, hits both countries' financial intermediaries, we see that the moments are the standard errors are roughly similar, except for the risky returns that are off a bit. I don't have any mechanism to solve the risk premium muscle, so that's normal. And for the correlations, we can see for the benchmark model, I would predict the right direction. But for the real shock case, the real shock case will actually trigger a conventional risk sharing dynamics. We can see that the correlation are mostly in the opposite direction. And this was consistent with the Gorichas and Ray paper, or I wouldn't say the Gorichas Ray paper. I should say the Maggiori paper that he got the exchange rate direction wrong. So I can reproduce his result under real shock, that the exchange rate movements are in the opposite direction. But under my shock, my financial shock, the direction, they are all in the same direction. Okay, for the last minutes, let me briefly discuss about the impulse response to help you understand the mechanism in my model. So what happens during a financial shock? So what happens that both countries' financial intermediaries are tightened. We see a rise in the convenience yield. We will see the drop in the equity prices and the rise in the convenience yield because the financial intermediaries are tightened. So as the U.S. are the holder of the trees and the foreigners holder of the safe assets, so we see a drop of the net foreign asset. However, we will see a increase in the net investment income that is opposite to the direction of net foreign asset. Why is that? The net increase comes from two parts. One is the U.S. Treasury becomes more expensive, and the foreigners are the parts that the foreigners are holding is generating less income for them. The second part is that the U.S. is holding more foreign trees, as the foreign is holding more U.S. safe assets there, so it's generating more income for them. The result of this is that the real exchange rate would increase, so the U.S. dollar would appreciate. However, for the real shock, things getting a little different. Although under a real shock, we will still observe a rise in the convenience yield and a drop for the equity price and drop for the net foreign assets. So why is this case different from the last case? Because the US are the holder of the risky trees. If now the trees are paying less, so indeed the US is suffering a loss, which is different from the previous case. The trees are still paying their normal level. Now the trees are paying less. That will cause the U.S. exchange rate to depreciate. So that's a difference between my story and this real shock case, under which the risk sharing story will take place.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Time to conclude, Zhefeng. Maybe we can delay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I just one more slide showing that my model. So I can back up the data with my model with a backup financial shock. So the KD is 2.337 times of the standard deviation of the model shock calibrated over the entire sample period. So the financial shock is 2 times standard deviation. So I would say that's a reasonable number. So my model is not can replicate what happens during the financial crisis without having some crazy numbers. Okay, so the last part is the conclusion. I argue that the role of the U.S. in the international market is a service provider. So it's not a traditional insurance provider with risk sharing, but it's a service provider providing financial service that both in the normal time and in the crisis, people are going to demand. And when the financial system cracks down, people are going to demand more. And it's both a qualitative and a quantitative contribution. And I can explain the style aspect during the financial crisis.
Okay, thank you, Zhefeng.
Okay, thank you very much.
So now we have Karen can you stop sharing the slides, Zhefeng?
Yeah.
Hey, Karen, yeah, let me share the slide.
Do you see the slides?
Yes, and I can hear you. Just go ahead, Karen. Thank you.
Hold on a second. Hold on. Okay. Okay, I think we got it now. Okay, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. I don't know what my technological problems were, probably because I have a very cracked screen that just happened right before this morning. So at any rate, moving on, I just wanted to say this paper I think is a very interesting paper. And as Zifeng explained, it is really addressing the question of this so-called US exorbitant privilege and sort of asking again, how is this related to the risk sharing story that's often been used to sort of rationalize it? So just to say very quickly what the story is, this is, I think it was the term was first coined by Gourinchas and Ray, saying that the US has enjoyed this long period really of positive net foreign investment income, but at the same time, as you can see in the figure that he showed, you know, accumulating net foreign liabilities. And as I said before, you know, the story here has been, well, this is because of insurance provision during bad times, so-called global bad times, US assets and the dollar increase in value, and during normal times, US assets really are sort of, if you will, collecting an insurance premium. So that's kind of the standard view. Now, in this paper, what Zifeng does is something different, which is to say, well, let's look at this again over the global financial crisis. That should be a C and not an S, sorry for that. And basically, he argues this based on three so-called facts. One is that the US dollar has appreciated. That one you could argue in some ways is a little bit easier to rationalize. But the other two are kind of more important, which is, as he says, the US has become more indebted, became more indebted during the global financial crisis. But at the same time, the investment income didn't go down. And in fact, during this period of time, as he argues, foreigners bought expensive US treasuries, which would suggest that this insurance premium story really didn't pay off during this time. So his new story here is to say US safe assets provide a liquidity service, and this is the thing that he's going to go after in his model. So as I said, my general reaction is I think this is a very interesting paper. It's very thought-provoking. I certainly provoked a lot of thoughts in me. And I think it's also a very intuitive idea that the US earns a liquidity service fee kind of all the time. It's something I could explain to, you know, non-economists. I could explain to MBA students. It's very, I think, intuitive and compelling. So my comments are going to be, first of all, some suggestions to clarify some aspects of the story, maybe bolster the story. And I'm going to start off a little bit talking about the model, and then, time permitting, talk about the data, because as you could see in some of the questions came up this way, the data part is a very key and important part of this whole story. Okay, so first of all, Zifeng, I think, explained everything very well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details of the paper. But as you can see, it's set up as you have two countries that are identical, except for the very important part about the financial intermediaries. So households are receiving income and profits. They consume both tradables and non-tradables, and they make deposits. That's the only thing they can do in the asset market. The financial intermediaries are going to receive deposits, and then they're going to decide a portfolio between home government debt, foreign government debt, and a risky asset, which is a traded good tree. So traded goods fall out of this tree. And in equilibrium, they're going to choose not to, at least at home, to hold this, but at least in principle, this is what they could do. And then on the government side, they're going to be basically kind of boring in the sense that they're just going to issue debt and receive taxes. And as you know, I said, this is the same for the foreign country. So just kind of to scale it down then, what does the asset market look like? We have the home and the foreign households. They're making deposits to these financial intermediaries. And through these intermediaries, they're the ones basically in the asset market. Of course, this is the standard financial intermediary story. But the key thing that's going to be different here is that there are different financial constraints that these two different intermediaries face. And that's the key driver in this model. So my first question is, because it's set up as this is sort of like the risk sharing story doesn't work, insurance doesn't work, it's liquidity that matters. I think it's, as I say, a very compelling story, but I wondered, does it mean that we should think of it as risk sharing isn't relevant? Can we separate out the liquidity effect from the risk sharing effect? And really, as you can see there in the end of the presentation, the comparison in the model is really only between these two types of shocks. One is the liquidity shock, which is hitting the intermediaries, and you could see that in the presentation. And the other shock is on the goods market side, on traded goods. So the traded goods shock in the tree, this is the thing that in principle, these different households would like to do risk sharing with, right? But really, I think that sort of, since it's a key story there, you know, risk sharing, it's not really explored. It's sort of, let's look at these relationships, which I think is important, but I think it's also, if you're going to say it's not really risk sharing, how much is that mattering? And sort of as an example, I'm showing you here the exchange rate part of it. We know there's a long history on exchange rates and risk sharing. In fact, some of it was highlighted in the first paper this morning, sort of indirectly. So here, agents have time additive preferences, standard format. The beta is a little different here, but also there's a consumption aggregator over tradables and non-tradables. And now what Zifeng does in the model is actually even assume a little stronger than this, which is that non-tradables are constant and equal to 1. So the exchange rate here is really collapses to being a relative, the ratio of tradables and non-tradables across these two countries. And this is the coefficient alpha, which is going to govern, of course, how much you care about tradables. Now, the reason I raise this is because, as I say, there's a long history on this. And standard stories would tell us that there's a lot of action in that relationship. In fact, we know with no frictions with standard complete markets, they would share these tradable goods, and they would just be stuck. It should be stuck, not stuck, but stuck with the non-tradables they have, right? Now, with frictions, we also could look at, well, how important is that risk sharing story? One of the things we know there too is that depends on this parameter alpha, how much you care about tradables. And I'm just kind of pulling this as a simple example of this from a paper I have with Edith Liu, where we look at how important is, if we look at incomplete markets, how important is this wedge we see under the view of different exchange rates, and then under non-tradables, you can see it depends a lot on this parameter alpha. So if you care about tradables a lot, your risk sharing gains could be very high, 2.1%. But if we get down to a half, it's sort of, you don't care about tradables and versus non-tradables as much. If it's below that, you actually wouldn't want to share more tradables. So the bottom line here is I think that it would benefit the paper to say a little bit more about, you know, how much should we cast aside the risk sharing story versus other kind of this liquidity story to show that a little more cleanly. So I want to say a little bit more about the data side, because as you can see, it's very important. And the basic story here is, of course, very much about financial intermediaries. And so this really suggests, if I think about this in my head, I say, okay, these are constrained private institutions. But if you look, wasn't so clear to me from the talk, but certainly in the paper, that fact number 2 is really based on official holdings. So we're talking about who is holding this from foreign central banks, right? Central banks, I think, are very different than private banks. And in fact, the evidence suggests that they act very differently, foreign central banks, than foreign financial institutions. And this is just one paper that sort of points that out. So one suggestion would be to relate the model to the government debt holdings data by private entities. And just to sort of highlight that, I took this from this is the most recent IMF data for April this year. This is put up by Arsenop and Suda, and this is looking at US government debt by holders. So what am I showing you here? Well, first of all, this line here, the dark line, is showing the government debt as a share of GDP. And so no surprise, that's been increasing sort of since the global financial crisis in the US, but clearly since COVID of last year, we see this increase, okay? So that there is significant movement in the supply of debt. That said, what are these shaded things showing? Well, they're showing how much is our domestic central banks holding, that's in the green, domestic financial, private financials, that's in the light blue, foreign official sector, that's this here, and then this up here, the red, is the foreign financial sector. Okay, so a couple of things I wanted to point out about this is during the global financial crisis, you do see an increase in foreigners holding US government debt sort of during and after, but this is largely led by the official sector. And that is, I think, what is in the data that was represented here. If we look at the red part, which are the financial institutions, it's not as clear. Okay, so, and just as an FYI, this isn't part of the paper here, but I think it's also interesting to note in the last year and a half or so, the biggest increases really come from the domestic investors holding US government debt. And largely that's led, of course, by the Federal Reserve here. That's what you see in the dark green. Okay, and then the final comment I want to make, and this is also about the data, and this is a little bit probably maybe in the spirit of the next paper or an extension of this paper, because a lot of people focus on, I think, banks. But that said, we really, when we think about this, the story should be through any constrained financial intermediaries, not just necessarily banks. And what about non-bank financial intermediaries? We know that they're holding this government debt as well. We have hedge funds, pension funds, insurance companies, endowments. And all of them have differing degrees of constraints and motives. So if I don't have, if I'm not as constrained, I'm a hedge fund, maybe I look different than a bank that does have these liquidity constraints. So this is, I think, one of the directions the literature is moving, or at least I would suggest that it needs to move. And again, this is not just this paper. So I would think about considering these investors, at least down the road, and the evidence suggests that they do play an important role. So I took this from, this is from a joint project with Shangfeng, Brian Hardy, where we're looking at, now this is not just the US, to be clear, this is all countries, around, not all countries we can get data for, 95 countries over this period of time. And what is this showing you? This is showing if there is an increase in government debt, which right now there is, who's going to be holding it? And so these are over here. This is showing the regression coefficient of that expansion, how much is held by foreign banks, foreign portfolio managers, think of those as non-banks, foreign official, and all of the domestic sort of as a group. Okay, so what is the takeaway here? Well, and by the way, these add up to 1. So you think of these as shares. How much is taken proportionally as you expand debt? And this is just the average over time in case you want to look at it. But this is the response. The point here is that if we look at expansions and contractions in government debt, those that are responding the most are not the foreign banks. They're the foreign private institutions that are not banks. So that I think bears studying. Again, I throw this out to all of us, not just to Zifeng on this one. Okay, so to conclude, I thought this was a very insightful, thought-provoking paper. And as I said, I provoked a lot of thoughts for me. So I just have some suggestions for future clarifications and extensions. In particular, I think it would be helpful in the model to address more, instead of just looking at these 2 shocks, but look at the role of risk sharing versus liquidity, more specifically, if that's the takeaway you want the reader to have. And then in the data, kind of looking at how, the private institutions versus the official financial institutions, these behave, I think, very differently and would bear some, at least, inspection in the data since it's so key. And then this is my sort of I think we should all think about banks versus non-banks. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's a fantastic discussion. I definitely learned a lot. I hope Zifeng and other audience feel the same. Zifeng, you have like a, you can give a very brief response to Karen first. Maybe you can later email Karen to discuss more.
Yeah, and can I say one thing? An apology. I didn't send the slides. I didn't know. I'm happy to do that, Zifeng. We can talk later.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So Zifeng,
yeah, I just want to say thank you for Karen. Karen is raising 3 very good points. Actually, those points. Do we have time to for me to discuss it a little bit? Or
just very briefly, one or 2 minutes, because Luca has a question. Yeah.
Yeah, for the first point, Karen is definitely correct that you cannot actually separate risk sharing from the other channel. For any of the macro model, you have a financial market, there will be risk sharing. So the important is that my liquidity mechanism has to overcome the existing risk sharing mechanism in order to drive the dynamics into correct direction. But I definitely agree with Karen that this is important. If I separate them, let's say how much. So how much is maybe risk sharing is negative some amounts, and my liquidity is how much amount, and they combine to give a positive effect. So I think that's a very good suggestion. I will work on that. And for the second part actually I thought about it. I'm not sure how you guys will feel about it. Is the first is the data issue. Actually, the aggregate treasury is not. It's include everything. It's not just official. Only the short term. The short term treasuries are from official holdings because the treasury reporting system only reports for that. But aggregate data is for both the government sector and the private sector. And it's definitely very important that Karen raises that actually it's the foreign official holders that are buying the sorry, the foreign official holders are buying the extra treasuries like during the 2010, and I think that's an important fact. So my tentative response is that so the government, so the official sector buying this buying these safe assets, the extra treasuries, is also for the sake of stabilize the financial systems to help with the
okay, so yeah, because Luca has a question, you can definitely email. Yeah, Karen definitely will be happy to give you more suggestions, discuss. Yeah, I know Karen. So Luca, you have a question?
Okay.
Yeah, very nice paper. It was a very quick one. What happens during a financial crisis? To the US current account? Does it improve or worsen?
Sorry?
What happens during a global financial crisis to the US current account? Does it improve or worsen in your model?
It improves a little bit. It improves.
Okay.
Okay, all right, we are on time. So I will thank you, Karen, again. Thank you, Zhefeng, for the interesting paper. Thank you guys for questions. Let me pass this over to Mindy, our, who did a lot of work for helping organize the conference. Thank you, Mindy.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the last session and last paper for today. We're very happy to have Yang Jiao from Fudan University to present a paper on international trade and the currency composition of corporate debt. And the discussant is Jesse Schreger from Columbia. He's a star scholar in international finance. So thank you. And Yang Jiao, you have the same 35 minutes. Yeah, you can have the slides uploaded now. Thanks.
Sure. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me full screen. Okay, thank you, Mindy, for the introduction, and good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. So many thanks to the organizers to include me in the nice conference, and also thanks to Jesse for agreeing to kindly discuss the paper. So today I will present a paper titled International Trade and the Currency Composition of Corporate Debt. It's a joint work with Oyun, who is in the audience from Drexel University, and also Ji Wazhou from Hanyang University. So introduction. So it's well known that firms in developing or emerging countries, they are usually exposed to foreign currency debt. Okay, so it's well known that when these firms, they borrow from abroad, they often borrow in foreign currency. So and some firms in these countries are also exposed to another kind of exchange rate risk. For example, some firms engage in international trade in exporting or importing. So in this paper, we ask the following specific question, which combines these two exchange rate risk exposures. So we ask the question how international trade will causally affect firms' choice of currency composition of debt. And this is also sometimes coined as operational hedge. So we think this question is very important for developing and emerging countries, because in these countries, they usually have provide a very limited financial hedge to firms. So operational hedge can be very important. And also we know that in recent decades, these countries are also more integrated in international trade, so that we think that this question is going to be relevant. So, but why do we really care about this question? We think that there are at least two dimensions that we think that this question is important. The first dimension is that there are going to be implications for macro from our research. So one widely discussed phenomenon in emerging or developing countries is called the balance sheet effects related to foreign currency borrowing. The basic idea is that when firms, they borrow in foreign currency, but when their revenue is in local currency, they are going to subject to a currency mismatch. So whenever there is a currency depreciation, their debt in terms of foreign currency debt, when we converted them to local currency, it's going to be larger, right? So the increased leverage will potentially hurt firms' balance sheet if financial frictions matter. So we can see that there are a lot of literature actually just assumes that some firms, they actually borrow in foreign currency, but they earn in local currency. But in this paper, we will examine to what extent firms actually use operational hedge to manage this kind of a foreign exchange risk. So we think this question is important, and the causal inference is going to be important. So to be honest, there are already a lot of literature documenting a positive correlation between exporting and foreign currency borrowing. So for example, people use cross-section of firms and run a regression of using foreign currency on this exporting status. And people do find a positive correlation. We think that the causal inference is very important because this kind of regressions may be subject to some endogeneity concerns. For example, there may be a variable bias, there may be attenuation bias, these kind of issues. For instance, if there are some omitted variables that are unobserved to econometrization, but can drive both exporting and foreign currency borrowing, then it's unknown to us whether these firms actually use operational hedge to manage foreign exchange rates. So we will discuss more in detail. So we think that our research is also going to have implications for international trade. So, so for people in trade, we typically talk about gains from trade. And for gains from trade, people usually do not consider the currency dimension. So we think that our research will also provide additional insight on these gains from trade or gains from international trade integration. So the reason is that usually international trade for these emerging or developing countries is invoiced in foreign currency, especially in US dollars. So if there is a trade shock to these firms, and if these firms respond by altering the composition of their borrowing in foreign currency and the local currency, then the average cost of borrowing of these firms can change. For instance, that we know that it's well known that usually borrowing in US dollars is cheaper and then borrowing in domestic currency for these countries. So if these firms, after a positive, for example, a positive export shocks, they start to borrow more in foreign currency, then the average cost of the borrowing cost for these firms will fall. So this is the outline. So we will provide a very stylized, simple model for optimal currency composition of corporate debt choice. And the model will predict that when export shares go up, the endogenous foreign currency debt shares will also go up. And then we will provide some empirical evidence to support this. So firstly, we just document some cross-sectional patterns as the literature has documented. And then we try to address some endogeneity problem coming from these cross-sectional patterns. We will first use a long difference OLS regression to difference out all the time invariant firm characteristics. And in this case, there are still some remaining endogeneity concerns. So we will use go one step further, trying to use the IV approach to address the endogeneity concerns. Specifically, we propose a new method to instrument the export shares of these firms. And this new instrument will employ information on the domestic demand shock and all South Korea's trading partners demand shock at the industry level. And we then provide further robustness checks and some additional findings that will favor the mechanism we highlight in this paper. We will first discuss the role of financial hedge as the data provides the information on that as well. We also try to address the concerns related to exclusion restrictions when we construct our instrumental variable. We will also define alternative foreign currency debt share using net debt instead of debt. This definition will take into account the currency composition of the firm's cash. And finally, we will also discuss the role of exchange rate regime. So we will try to divide South Korea's into several periods with high exchange rate volatility and a low exchange rate volatility. We will show that with lower exchange rate volatility, the relationship between export shares and foreign currency debt shares will be weaker. And lastly, we take into account the rising attention to the global supply chains, because we know that in recent decades, when we talk about international trade, it's not only about trading the final good, but it's also about intermediate good. So, so essentially production firms in their input, they also use a lot of those inputs from foreign countries. And those inputs are also usually invoiced in foreign currencies. Okay? So that means another dimension of foreign currency exposure. We will take that into account as well. So this is the literature. I will just skip it, and interested readers can just go to our paper for details. So this is the outline of the presentation. Now we will provide the simple model here. Okay? So consider an individual firm with productivity phi, and the firm will engage in international activities, not only in the debt side, but also in the revenue side. Okay? So which means that they can borrow in two currencies, a local currency and a foreign currency. And also, when we think about the firm's revenues, it will consist of both domestic sales and export sales. We will assume that export sales are all in foreign currency. We will also show some data related to this assumption. So we will divide the model into two stages. One stage is called the borrowing stage. The second stage is called the production stage. In the borrowing stage, the firms try to raise some capital, K here, and they borrow in local currency B and the foreign currency B star. This is the amount of the debt, and with interest rate R and R star respectively in each currency, local currency and foreign currency. And in the borrowing stage, we will assume that we will normalize the current exchange rate to 1. But in the future, there will be exchange rate risk. So they do not know what exchange rate shock psi will be in the next period. So in the production stage, they will decide the amount of the quantity of their production Q, and the quantity that is going to be sold in domestic market, and the quantity of their production that's going to be sold in the foreign market, which is Q star here. And the right-hand side is just the total output of the firm. So K is the capital, which is going to be financed by their borrowing, and L is going to be the labor input. So the home and the foreign demand function are taken as given. So here we just take a very simple constant elasticity demand function, which means that the demand elasticity is this eta. And P and P star will denote the price in domestic market and in foreign market, in local currency and foreign currency respectively. And E and E star are going to be demand shifters into markets. So for simplicity, we will also assume full depreciation of capital after the production. So now let's consider the firm's problem. So we will use a backward, solve the model in a backward manner. So firstly, we will solve the second stage. In the second stage, the firm already knows the realization of psi, and also it has some debts in place, right? B and B star, which they borrowed in the previous period. And the firm's profit maximization problem is going to be the following: that they choose the quantity they are going to sell in domestic market and the foreign market, Q and Q star. And the first two terms are about their revenues in domestic market and foreign market. Note everything is going to be converted to local currency now, right? So that you can see a psi here when I write down the revenues from the foreign country. And they will also pay their labor cost. W is the labor cost, which is wage. And this is the end of the period, and they will pay back their debts in local currency and in foreign currency. And when they pay back their foreign currency debt, they are going to subject to this psi here, right, which is the new exchange rate. Okay. As you can see, the firm is going to be subject to two exchange rate risks, right? One is on the revenue side, the other is on the paying back the debt side in the second period. Right? So after knowing this psi and the demand function, we are going to be able to solve this Q and Q star in the second stage, production stage. So we can see that it's going to be a function of this K and the B star, right? So it's very intuitive that when this K, which is raised in the first period, is larger, in the second period, their revenue is going to be larger. Right? This is already after the labor cost. And also, if the K is very large, it means that the firm will borrow a lot in the first period because they borrow to finance their capital. So B and B star will also likely be larger. So that's going to be a trade-off for the firm's problem when they choose that, right, overall. But there is also going to be a risk dimension. So you can see that in the revenue side, after paying this labor tax, labor cost, there is a psi here. And in the cost side, the debt payment side, there is also going to be a psi here. So intuitively, you can think that these firms, if they are risk averse, they are going to try to match this currency composition in the revenue side and in the debt payment. So now we introduce some notation here. Here there is alpha, which is going to be the demand shift in the foreign country divided by the demand shift in the domestic country plus the demand shift in foreign country. So essentially, this alpha can be viewed as the export share for the firm currently, right? And they are going to take this as given. Okay? So, and then we will also introduce another notation, which is gamma. Gamma is going to be the summation of this domestic demand shifter and the foreign demand shifter. So, pi tilde in this equation is going to be increasing in the productivity and also the demand shifter, which is very intuitive, right? So both supply side and demand side will affect the revenue of the firm or the profit of the firm in the end. So now let's go to the first stage, the borrowing stage. In the borrowing stage, we assume the firm's objective function is going to be risk averse. This is the mean variance function of firm. Although we assume this in the baseline model, we actually provide a micro foundation for this production function when the firm is actually inherently risk neutral. So we will micro found this utility function by introducing a financial frequency in an extended period, so that the net worth, this not only the level of net worth for the firm matters, but also the volatility of the net worth will matter, because financial frequency will take effect in the next period, and the net worth will enter into the financial frequency in an extended period. So now let's take this utility function as given and solve the model. Okay, so as you can imagine, if there is UIP uncovered interest parity, on average, the borrowing cost for the foreign currency and the borrowing cost for the local currency is going to be the same, right? So because the firm is risk averse, so on the UIP, firms will essentially fully eliminate ex-ante risk. So however, if there is a UIP deviation, especially when US dollar borrowing is cheaper, you will see that the firm will have more incentive to borrow in foreign currency. But that will likely work as overall shifter for all the firms, right? If they start to borrow in foreign currency. So we will show that on the first order approximation, the optimal foreign currency debt share, this is the left-hand side, is going to be related to the alpha here, which is the export share. And there is a one-to-one mapping positive relationship. Okay, so we actually use a simple model to show that there is actually a simple relationship between export share and foreign currency debt share. And we try to use data to explore this phenomenon. Okay, so, and in a causal way. Okay. So now let's go to our data. Our data is from South Korea. It's called Korea Information Service data set on the firm's balance sheet. And so by law in Korea, firms with assets larger than 7 billion won assets, they are required to report their balance sheet. But there are also some smaller firms, they voluntarily report. And so our data actually include not only big firms, but also small firms. And as Kim, Tessa, and John, they also use this case data. They actually point out that the case data has the advantage of capturing many small firms in addition to big firms. And there is a very distinctive feature of the data set is that it will include detailed information on the foreign currency debt. And we also use other data sets like including BASI CP2, UN Comtrade on trade flows between any two countries at the community level for each year, and also use some Korean IO table or data when we go to the import share part. So firstly, we try to examine the quality of the data. We try that in two dimensions. The first dimension is to look at the total exports reported in the case data and compare that with the official aggregate data reported by South Korea to the UN. We will try to show that they actually track each other very well. So these firms are very representative in terms of exporting activities. We also try to plot the total foreign currency debt of the case data and compare that with South Korea's aggregate external debt. And we also find that they track each other very well. We also try to point out that in our study, we will focus on South Korea between 1999 to 2007, which is after the Asian financial crisis, but before the global financial crisis. We think it's very ideal for our study for the following reasons. So firstly, in this period, the foreign currency is very dominant in Korean export invoicing and import invoicing, which means that the export share, you can regard that directly as the foreign currency revenue share. And also we argue that we can see that in the data actually, in this period, there are going to be significant degree of exchange rate volatility for South Korea. But before 1999, South Korea is essentially a crawling peg exchange rate regime, which means that there's very little exchange rate risk. But after 2007, South Korea started to strengthen its capital controls in its banking sector, and also it strengthens the financial derivatives regulations as well. So we think that that period is also not ideal for our study, because the foreign currency debt borrowing will be driven by a lot by this policy change in the capital controls. So this is the data. We compare the case data in dotted line and also the official aggregate export data for South Korea reported to UN. And we find they actually track each other very well. Okay? And also we try to plot case data, the foreign currency debt, and compare that with South Korea's official external debt. Notice here, I do not have data on the official foreign currency debt at the aggregate level. But we do find this official external debt for the non-financial sector in South Korea. We also find that they have a very similar trend. So we can interpret this as the fact that when South Korea's non-financial sector borrow from abroad, they actually mostly borrow in foreign currency. However, note there are some gaps here, right? So these gaps can be explained by several reasons. Maybe it's because that some South Korea's non-financial sector, when they borrow from abroad, they actually borrow in local currency. It could also be that this non-financial sector include not only the firms we include in this case data, but also include firms, for example, like in the NGO and some firms not included in case data, right? And also maybe some household even. But overall, they track each other relatively well. So next,
can I ask one quick question about the debt data? I think that's super interesting. So so in the KIS data, so do we know it is a direct corporate bond issue in the market, or it go through intermediate like the bank credit line, and then you have a relationship with the bank, so you can have credit line in US dollar, or it's a corporate bond? I'm just wondering.
I think we do not have that breakdown, like whether you borrow from the bank or borrow from the market, the bond market, in case data at least. But I believe in Korean central bank, they have detailed data on the whether you borrow from the banks or financial intermediaries or from the bond market. Yeah, but case
Yang, so if firms purchase derivative contracts to insure themselves against exchange rate risk, do you observe that in the data?
Yeah, we have information on the currency forward and swaps.
I see.
I will go to that point later. Okay, very good. So, so this is about Korean export currency composition. So as you can see, this is the fraction, right? So mostly around 90% of Korean export is invoiced in US dollars. And there are also some fractions for other currencies like a euro and Japanese yen, and also there is a slight rise in Chinese RMB. But there's very little Korean won. Okay? So it's less than 1% over all the periods for South Korea. So essentially it's not, when you talk about export sales for Korean firms, it's not in local currency. It's mostly in foreign currency, and it's dominantly invoiced in US dollars. So this one is about exchange rate regimes. We know that after the Asian financial crisis, South Korea actually abandoned the crawling peg so that its exchange rate volatility is substantially enlarged compared to the pre-Asian financial crisis period. So in this period, you can view that there's very little exchange rate risk, but after 1999, you can see that there are a lot of exchange rate risk. So this is some summary statistics. I will just, due to time constraint, I will just quickly go to this point. So if we look at a long difference between 1999 to 2007, which means that you just subtract the foreign currency debt share in 2007 by the foreign currency debt share for a firm in 1999, right? So you will have this summary statistic here. You can see that there are around 5,000 firms in our data set, and there is a substantial dispersion of this foreign currency debt share change, right? And also for export share. So you can see that there are also substantial dispersion in this change in export share. Okay, so I also provided some preliminary summary statistics like conditional on firms use foreign currency debt. Okay, so this is only for foreign currency debt, and previously it's for all the firms in the case. So we find that the number of exporters among these foreign currency debt users is around 592. Okay, so this is among 1,300 foreign currency debt users, okay, in a given year. So this fraction of exporters among these foreign currency debt users is about 45%. And this is much larger than the full samples when you talk about what fractions of the data is actually exported, right? So this gives you a sense that there is a positive correlation between exporting and foreign currency debt usage. Okay? And we also find that in our data set, exporters actually account for around 2/3 of South Korea's firms' foreign currency borrowing. So, which means that exporters are pretty important for starting foreign currency borrowing in South Korea at least. So this is some empirics. We just try to test the simple relationship between foreign currency debt share and the export share. The first one is just the cross-sectional patterns. This is no way about causal inference, right? But it's about some patterns, right? Correlation patterns. And this I indicator I is for each firm. Okay? And we will include a set of controls X here. And we will also conduct a long difference exercise, which essentially means that we will difference out all the time invariant firm characteristics. For instance, in the setting one, there may be some omitted variable bias. Okay? Let me give you an example. If a firm has a manager who has a lot of overseas experience, for example, right? And the firm is for example, is more likely to engage in international trade, and it's also more likely to engage in foreign currency borrowing. And then it's hard to interpret that what do we get for this better estimate, right? So whether it's actually the operational hedging we are talking about in the model. Okay? So for long difference exercise, we essentially difference out kind of time invariance fixed effect, right?
Can I ask you? Just a quick question. So implicitly, you're treating all of this as the costs are in Korea. Do we know if any of these countries are doing any foreign production? Like I would think the larger ones, the Samsungs and so forth, because that would speak to, you're just looking at the export share on the revenue side, not the cost side.
For the cost side, we will talk about that later on the internet, on the incorporating the global supply chains. So we will have that part later. So okay. Thank you. So for this long difference regression, however, it's also likely to be subject to some endogeneity concerns. For instance, the firms can change its managers, right? So it can change its managers from a manager without overseas experience to a manager with overseas experience, right? And there will also be another channel that will drive both this change in foreign currency debt share and the change in the export share. So in that case, we will try to instrument this change in export share with the instrument, which we will talk in detail. So this is just some cross-sectional patterns. We show that although we include a lot of controls, we can still get there is a positive correlation between export share and the foreign currency debt share. I think due to time constraint, I will not go to detail on the fixed effects, but we actually also try other exercises to include more controls, like the firm's productivity, firm's foreign currency asset share, some other controls in the appendix also try to address other concerns. Okay? So then we go to the long difference. Long difference means that on the left-hand side, we have this change in foreign currency debt share. On the right-hand side, we have the change in the export share. We still find this positive relationship within 1999 and 2007, right? Although, and it holds when we control for a lot of controls as well. So as we discussed, there may still be some endogenic concerns there, so we try to address this issue here. So by definition, the change in the export share can be written as follows, right? So we can write the export share in 2007 minus that by this export share in 1999, right? And this 0 denotes the year 1999, and this I denotes the firm I. And for the export share in 2007, you can write that as export sales in 2007 divided by the total sales in 2007, right? And for this export sales in 2007, you can write that as export sales in 1999 multiplied by 1 plus the growth rate in this export sales. Right? And you can do that for the export sales in the denominator and also the domestic sales in the denominator with this growth rate here. We will try to instrument this growth rate. So that's the idea. So conceptually, this growth rate is going to be influenced by firm-specific factors and demand shocks, right? Which are going to be irrelevant with the firm's factors. So we are trying to project out the shocks to this G that are going to be exogenous to firms, which are mainly demand shocks at the more aggregate level. So what do we use? We will use foreign demand shocks and domestic demand shocks to instrument these two growth rates. So how can we do that? So for a firm for firm I in a given sector J, we can construct a demand shock at the industry level from a foreign country. How do we do that? So for South Korea, for any industry J in South Korea, initially they export to many countries. For example, they export to China, they export to the United States, and with some initial shares. For example, if South Korea is very near to China, maybe they export a lot to China in an electronic industry, for instance, right? And if within this period from 1999 to 2007, China's import growth in electronics actually grows a lot. That means a lot of demand shocks to industry J, the electronics industry in South Korea. So that's the basic idea. And when we construct this import growth from other countries, like any country K, we will try to use other country K's import growth from the rest of the world by excluding South Korea. So when we construct this import growth, it's not relevant to South Korea at all. So it's China's import from, for example, Japan, United States, Europe, all these countries, but not from South Korea. So this is the instrument for this demand shock for this export sales.
Zhao, you have 5 minutes left.
How many minutes? Sorry.
5 minutes. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Okay, so for the domestic sales growth rate, we will use this GDI, right? So we will also try to substitute this GDI here. However, we do not try to use the industry level information, because it could be that at the industry level, there will be some aggregate supply shocks to South Korea's some industry, and that could drive firms borrowing foreign currency and their domestic sales at the same time. So when we substitute this GDI, the domestic sales growth rate, we will use the national level growth rate between 1999 and 2007 in the manufacturing sector as a whole. So for the domestic absorption, we use the total output in manufacturing sector minus export plus import. Okay, so that's the domestic absorption growth. Okay, so we will denote this instrument as ZDI here. So how good are our instruments? So I plot a figure here. Each dot represents industry, and on the x-axis is the industry level demand shocks to South Korea, which we constructed from South Korea's trading patterns demand shocks. And the y-axis is South Korea's actual export growth. We actually find a strong positive relationship here, right? So you can see that Actually, foreign demand shocks can predict South Korea's export growth to a large extent. So this is our IRA, and we just report our first stage and also IRA regressions here. We find that the point estimate is actually slightly, not slightly, it's actually larger than the previous one. So which means that there could be some endogenous concerns with the OLS. So this is about financial hedging, and one concern is about financial hedging, that firms use currency swaps and forwards. In our data set, we have that information so that we will exclude firms with access to currency swaps and forwards. So for any year that firms use currency swaps and forwards, we will exclude that firm from the sample. Actually, these firms, the number of these firms are not large, and which is not surprising in South Korea. And we find that by dropping these firms, we still get the similar results and a slightly larger point estimate. But there are also some concerns on exclusion restrictions. For example, when we construct the foreign demand, use the foreign demand shocks, it could be driven by some foreign credit supply shocks. And these foreign credit supply shocks may also increase the, means that the banks from these countries can also increase their lending to South Korea, which will make the exclusion restrictions invalid. So we will just drop the major lenders of South Korea. They are actually identified from BIS aggregate data, US, Japan, France, Germany, and the UK. And we reconstruct our instruments without taking into account the major lenders. And we find the similar results. Okay? And we also redefine our debt using net debt instead of debt. And this is for the exchange rate regime discussion. Before 1999, we have mentioned that the exchange rate volatility is very small. So we expect the impact of this change in export share is going to be smaller for the change in foreign currency debt share. And that's indeed the case. And sometimes it's actually statistically not significant. And lastly, I will incorporate the role of global supply chains. So we will revise the production function to incorporate the foreign input here. So you can see there is for the intermediate input, we will also not only have domestic input but also foreign input, and there is a lumped share here. We try to show theoretically when there is an increase in this lumped, actually the foreign currency data share is going to be smaller. In our data set, we actually do not directly observe this foreign intermediate input for these firms. However, this case data actually report a foreign currency and a local currency account payables, and also the total intermediate input. So with additional assumptions and combined with Korean IO table, which I do not have time to discuss in detail, we will try to construct the foreign intermediate input here. And this is just to show that for the import side, actually Korea, when they do international trade, is also in.
Do we lose him? Okay.
So I just conclude, we investigate the role of international trading in causally shaping firms' currency composition.
Joe, we missed you for 30 seconds. Maybe could you go back a little bit?
Go back this page?
Yeah.
So I just try to show that in the data we also here we'll have negative impact on the change in foreign currency data share. This is the opposite to the export side. So that's the basic idea. So thank you. Let me just conclude. We investigate the role of international trading in causally shaping firms' currency composition of debt. We provide a model and a lot of empirics and trying to address endogenous concerns. And we also incorporate the role of global supply chains, which is new to the literature as well. And we think that quantitative exercise will be left for future research. Although we try to argue that firms actually do some natural hedge in when they borrow in foreign currency, but to what extent the endogenous choice of currency comes in debt in response to trade shocks is going to be a quantitative issue. So we do not take a strong stand in that point up to now, but we are trying to working on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yang Jiao and Jesse. So Yang, can you stop sharing the screen? And our discussants, Jesse from Columbia.
Great. coming through?
Yes.
Excellent. So thanks so much to the organizers for the invitation to discuss this excellent paper. Let me just kind of jump right in. So where I see this kind of paper, kind of immediately fitting in the literature is going back to this idea of Eichengreen and Hausman called so-called original sin, that they really kind of emphasized, actually in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, that one of the big sources of financial fragility in emerging markets was the inability to borrow in their own currency. And so when the exchange rates appreciated, balance sheet effects would cause kind of massive disruption, leading to very sharp and painful recessions. Now, since the Asian financial crisis and since Eichengreen and Hausman kind of began this literature, there's been this shift that governments in many emerging markets have actually begun borrowing in local currency. So they've kind of shifted away from the so-called idea of original sin. But we see that across emerging markets, when firms tap international capital markets to borrow from foreign investors, they overwhelmingly do so in foreign currency. And so, why do I think this paper is important is there's this open question of, how much does sovereigns moving away, but firms staying in foreign currency actually reduce, original sin? Because, when you come to the question of why do firms borrow in foreign currency, if you think of where the government is getting the revenue, it's kind of, taxes. You might think of, the government as kind of being one big non-tradable sector. But if what you see is firms actually doing the foreign currency borrowing, and they're actually borrowing, it's primarily exporters doing this, then maybe we don't necessarily have to worry as much. And so understanding this question of why exactly firms are going to want to borrow in foreign currency is really important for understanding, how much we've moved away from this kind of original sin idea and foreign currency debt being the source of financial fragility in emerging markets. And so the answer, in this paper is what can help explain the extent to which firms borrow in foreign currency. It's primarily going to be export revenues and this exposure abroad. So to begin my discussion, let me actually go through kind of a much simplified version of the framework in the paper to kind of highlight what I think are the key trade-offs. So I'm going to simplify quite a bit of what Young talked about. I'm going to assume basically firms are going to produce 1 unit of a good in period 2, and exogenously there's going to be some share 1 minus alpha that's going to be sold domestically, and I'm going to assume that some share alpha is exported. I'm going to assume the price of the good at home is 1, and the price abroad is going to be basically the level of the exchange rate, with the expected exchange rate at the time of pricing expected to be 1. Okay. I'm going to abstract from intermediate good use, and the only thing that firms are going to have to decide on is they're not even going to choose the amount they borrow. I'm going to assume they have to also borrow 1 unit. I'm going to assume that they have to borrow 1 unit when they go abroad, and that they can choose a share fee FC that's in foreign currency. So essentially the choice of firms is just going to be how much do they want to borrow in foreign currency. And I'm even just going to make one more assumption. I'm just going to normalize the foreign interest rate, so the dollar interest rate, to 0. Okay. So what's in this simplified model, kind of what is, what's going on with the firm? The realized firm profits are just going to be their revenues net of their debt repayments. Okay. So what are firm revenues? Well, whatever they sell at home, 1 minus alpha, has a price of 1. So that's the revenue from domestic sales. And then the revenue from their foreign sales are just the exchange rate times the share they sell abroad. So if because I'm assuming firms are pricing in dollars, if the exchange rate depreciates, the profit in yuan is actually going to increase. Now, what's happening on the debt repayment side? So the first part is just how much firms need to repay of what they borrowed in foreign currency. In local currency. So the local currency interest rate is this R, and they borrow 1 minus fee in this local currency. Now, because I've normalized the foreign interest rate to 0, how much do they have to repay on their dollar debt? It's just the share they borrowed in dollars times the realized level of the exchange rate. So that's it. That's firms' realized profit. Now, Those profits are realized in the second period. We now have to step back to the first period and ask, at the time that firms are choosing the currency composition of their debt, what do they expect their profits to be? So their expected profits are literally just going to be, minus the interest rate times how much they borrow in local currency. So essentially, the more you borrow in local currency, the lower are your expected profits, because we're assuming that UIP fails and borrowing in Korean won is more expensive than borrowing in dollars. Now, what are the variance of firms' profits? Well, it's just going to be the variance of the exchange rate times the difference in the share of goods that the firm exports relative to the share of the debt that is denominated in foreign currency. And so you can immediately see here that if firms set their foreign currency debt share to their export share, they can essentially completely eliminate any variability in profits. Okay. So just like the paper had, I'm just going to assume that firms have mean variance preferences, and so expected utility or welfare is just expected profits minus gamma for risk aversion over 2 times the variance of profits. Now, what is the firm's choice? It's just maximizing this objective by choosing the share of debt that is denominated in foreign currency. And so what you get is a very simple expression for the optimal foreign currency debt share. Okay, so let's look at the first term first here. So here what we see is the higher is the foreign interest rate. The higher is the local interest rate relative to dollars. So the higher is borrowing costs in won, the more the firm is actually going to want to borrow in foreign currency. If the dollar interest rate is 0 and the won interest rate is 10%, you're going to want to borrow more in dollars. Now, of course, that's going to be scaled down by the firm's effective risk aversion, gamma, times the variance of exchange rates, sigma psi squared. The final term is just going to be this alpha. It's going to be this exchange rate. This is going to be this export hedging channel. The more you sell abroad, the more you're getting dollar revenues, the more foreign currency debt you're going to want to borrow to minimize the variance of your profits. And so you can kind of see immediately here, if we were to assume that UIP holds, we would just say R equals R star, and this term would go away, and we would have full matching of revenues and liabilities. That if you don't care about this cost channel, you're just going to borrow more in foreign currency. You're just going to borrow exactly as much in foreign currency to match your export share. Okay, and this is essentially the mechanism that's underlying what's going on in the paper here. This kind of trade-off between you can minimize the variance of your profits by kind of matching your liabilities. And so with that in mind, let me talk about kind of the paper's empirical contribution. So essentially what the paper's after is trying to explain how much of firm I's foreign currency share can be explained by their export share. Now, as Yang mentioned and went through very clearly, there's this identification challenge that there could be omitted variable bias, that maybe some time invariant firm characteristics are going to drive both the export share and the foreign currency share. Reverse causality. Maybe firms have to borrow in dollars and they're going to export more to minimize this balance sheet. And so the paper is going to take essentially 3 approaches to estimate this regression. First is going to be a cross-sectional regression with controls. Then it's going to be a long difference. And I think kind of the most promising by far and really compelling is the instrument for firm level export shares using foreign industry level demand shocks. And so just to go over the main results, what are if you just run the cross-sectional regression, you tend to find, and this is what the paper kind of cites as the benchmark result, is that for every 10% increase in the export share, we should expect a 1% increase in the foreign currency debt share. That's just the cross-sectional regression. For the long difference, we tend to find, the authors tend to find it being around, a 10% increase would cause roughly half a percentage point increase in the foreign currency debt share. And most interestingly is this IV regression, where the goal is really to essentially be able to say this is a causal relationship. And here we actually find kind of a slightly stronger relationship that once we instrument for the change in the export share with basically the change in foreign demand, excluding exports from Korea, we see that a 10% increase in the export share is going to cause a 1.2% increase in the firm's foreign currency debt share. So some suggestions and kind of something I'd love to see the paper do a little bit more is to kind of connect this foreign borrowing decision with firm size. And so here I want to kind of bring back my kind of simple expression for what the optimal foreign currency debt share would be. So the literature has shown that larger firms tend to borrow more in foreign currency, regardless of their kind of export status. And so, how would this connect to the model? So the micro foundation of this mean variance preferences is this idea of kind of financial constraints. And so you can kind of immediately think through if kind of the larger, bigger firms like Samsung is kind of less likely to be financially constrained. In this setup, they'd be precisely the firms that would tend to have kind of a lower risk aversion. And so you could immediately see that, that would be the kind of a force that would push firms to borrowing in foreign currency. Similarly, I think that so some of my own work and also Salomon and Varela have kind of shown that firms behave as if there's this fixed cost of borrowing in international capital markets. That it looks as if firms have to kind of form relationships to tap these international capital markets. And so you could think that most firms tend to only do this kind of foreign currency borrow when they do it at scale. And so what you can really think of is this is actually going to mean that the effective foreign currency interest rate of large firms is lower than that faced by small firms. So you can think that larger firms are going to behave as if the interest differential between won and dollars tends to be higher. And so of course, these are going to go together because just like kind of the Mellis model and the rest of international trade, we know that kind of exporters tend to be larger firms. And so one thing that I'd also be particularly interested to see is how much this demand IV can actually predict increases in firm size, or if it doesn't at all. Because I think that one of the reasons I was so excited about this instrument is it has this ability to kind of tease apart kind of competing stories for why firms borrow in foreign currency. And finally, this is actually basically how Young ended his presentation. That I would love to get a little bit, coming back to this idea of original sin, I'd love to see a slightly more guidance provided about this connection between the model and data. So here I reproduced the proposition 2, that essentially the optimal share of foreign currency debt is going to increase with the firm's export share alpha and falling with the intermediate import share. And so this headline number is this 1% increase in the export share is going to cause a 10 basis point increase in the foreign currency debt share. What I'd really love to understand is how to interpret this elasticity in the view of the model. How would I know whether this operational hedge is big enough that we can treat firms as if they are not mismatched versus how much of corporate borrowing is kind of still being driven by this interest rate differential, regardless of this operating hedge motive. And with that, let me conclude. I think this is an excellent paper. I think they're going at one of kind of the big questions in international macro, and the ambition to kind of bring a novel identification strategy to this kind of, what I think is kind of the most important part of the original sin literature, I think is a real contribution. And so it was a pleasure to have the chance to discuss it.
Thank you for the great discussion, Jesse. Okay, so Yang Zhao, and do you want to respond briefly?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jesse, for the excellent discussion. Actually, one thing perhaps you do not know is that Jesse is one of my advisors at Columbia. So I got a bit nervous when I presented because it reminded me of my graduate study in Columbia. Okay. And I think the model is summarized is actually much nicer than what we did actually. So it's simpler and also to the point, right? So to what we are trying to see. And for the comment on Dutch demand, I will lead to an increase in firm size. I didn't try that, but I actually try to control some kind of firm size. I remember I tried that, and it doesn't affect much. And in our appendix, we actually also try to include other controls like firms' labor productivity and foreign currency asset share, this kind of information. But I think for firm size, we also tried. We can definitely add that to the paper as well. But that's a great comment. And for the elasticity, I think it's also a very great comment. I would say that from, so perhaps I can share my screen a little bit, is that from our finding is that we actually, if we try to plot some simple stuff, like just scatter plots. And if we look at the export relationship, the cross-sectional export share and the foreign currency debt share, so this is also roughly, for example, 0.1, right? So as we estimated. So what we actually try to do, we would calculate the hedge ratio, right? So the export share minus the foreign currency debt share. So you can see that mostly these firms are actually exposed, for exporters at least, they are exposed to the export revenues currency risk instead of the foreign currency debt share. If I want to interpret this graph in terms of this currency risk exposure, on average, at least, it's not on the foreign currency debt side for export, but it's on the export share, this export revenue side. But I think we do need to connect more closely for our models parameters with our point estimates in the empirical part, which we currently didn't have this discussion. But we think that's very excellent guidance.
Okay, great. So I know it's getting late for some of us in China, but any questions and comments from the audience? We have probably just like 1 minute or so.
Can I just, echoing some of what Jesse said, I think that it would be, I mean, first of all, I think this is a great paper, but it would be nice to be able to relate it to what we would expect to see. And that's why, and I was struck by what Jesse said about the, borrowing more by larger companies, where those are the ones that we also would expect to also have more costs in foreign currency. So if anything, it seems like they would have other ways to operationally hedge it. So I'm particularly interested in the supply chain part of it. So I'm going to read the paper now more carefully than before, but I just want to echo that if we could relate that to the size and also the cost, which is crucial for figuring out how much exposure they have.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Then that's conclude our first session of the workshop today. So we're going to continue tomorrow at the same time. We're going to have 3 papers on monetary and fiscal policy, and same time from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. East Coast time. And again, let's thank all the presenters and discussants. Okay, thank you, all of the attendants too. Okay, that's conclude. See you all tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.